The day begins as it always does in the rural stretches of France. You wake before dawn, the soft murmur of the land already stirring beneath your feet. The air is thick with the scent of damp earth, heavy from the dew of the night, but soon, as the sun begins to creep above the horizon, it will be thick with the heat of the day. The creak of wooden carts, the steady rhythm of work, these sounds are your companions. The faint rustle of leaves and the gentle breeze that winds through the trees is a small reprieve. Even the simple act of setting the plow to the field feels like an eternity. It's a daily rhythm that has become ingrained in the bones of every peasant. You hear the distant murmur of the village people rising to begin their tasks, the clinking of tools, the hushed exchange of labor and words. But all of this is calm, a small, methodical dance of survival. Beyond the fields there's the distant sound of something else. Far away, across the river, across the land, there's the clamor of revolution, the storming of the Bastille, the cries of a promise that never seems to reach here, to your world. From this distance, the sounds are vague, abstract. It feels like a distant echo, a cry for something that has no place in the quiet, dust-covered fields of your existence. The scent of the land is a powerful thing. It is dust, the smell of sweat, and the constant grit of hard labor. The air is often tinged with the smell of hay, ripe for harvest, but sometimes stale and decaying, just as the land feels in the dry months. The faint smell of stale bread seems to cling to everything, the bread that barely sustains you, made from the last of what you had to bake before the grain ran out. And then, there's the unsettling scent of decay, the faint, ever-present smell of crops that have failed. The land isn't giving back as it should. The visual landscape stretches endlessly before you. The earth is dry, cracked, and rough lines etched deep like the furrows in the field. The horizon feels distant, muted by the oppressive weight of the sun. There is a palpable feeling of heaviness that hangs in the air. The sun beats down, an unforgiving force, while the rhythm of your work feels as relentless as the burning sky. The dust, too, seems to rise in the air, as if the very ground refuses to let go of the toil and the burden that it has absorbed. Here, in the rural reaches of France, survival is a constant, gnawing presence. The land, the sky, and the heat all come together, forming a world that seems indifferent to human struggle. But this is your reality, day after day. The revolution may rage in the cities, but here, the revolution feels like a distant dream. Liberty, equality, and fraternity are empty words that belong to a world far from your fields, far from your struggles. As we look back upon the events of the French Revolution, the dramatic scenes of the Bastille's fall or the guillotine's blade capturing our attention, we often overlook the lives of the people who truly bore the weight of it all. The peasants, the ones who labored the land, fed the nation, and provided the foundation for all the grand changes happening in Paris, remain the quiet figures in the background of history. We study the revolution not to relive it, but to better understand those unseen lives that carried its weight. These are the people who did not storm the Bastille, nor did they sit in the salons of Paris debating the future. Instead, they woke early each morning, laboring under the same oppressive sun, day after day, without the promise of the liberties that were being spoken of. The revolution is often viewed through the lens of the elite, the city dwellers, the speeches, and the rebellion. But it was the peasants who were the ones who actually suffered the consequences of such a massive upheaval. And this is where history can be tricky. We often romanticize the revolution, the great ideals of liberty and equality that spread across the land. But for the peasant, this was not a time of great change or liberation. Instead, it was a time of even greater struggle, a struggle to hold on to what little they had. The promises of equality never truly reached them, and the freedom they were promised remained elusive. They were caught in a web, one that no amount of grand revolutionary ideals could undo. In truth, the real revolution, the one of the land, the one of daily survival, was something far quieter, far slower, and far more painful than anything celebrated in the history books. The peasant's story is often left out, because it is the story of ordinary struggle, of working to live, of fighting against the elements and the systems that seem to exist only to keep them down. As we move through this journey together, we will shift from the quiet life of the peasants to the turmoil and terror of the revolution's aftermath. The reign of terror will follow, where even the nobility of France would not be safe from the guillotine's blade. Then, we will descend beneath the streets of Paris, into the catacombs, where the bones of the dead are hidden away, offering their own silent testimony to the chaos above. And finally, we will take a step back from the bloodshed of the revolution and enter the decadent halls of Versailles, where the aristocracy danced, unaware of the growing storm outside their gilded walls. The contrast between the struggle of the peasants and the opulence of Versailles could not have been starker, yet both were integral to the story of France's revolution. Liberty, equality, and fraternity may have been the rallying cries of the time, but for many, the reality was something altogether different. As we move through these segments, I invite you to reflect on the human cost of change. The grandeur of revolutionary ideals clashed sharply with the gritty reality of survival. The grand promises of liberty may have made their way to the cities, but for the peasant, they seemed distant, fleeting, and ultimately unfulfilled. The sun has barely crested the horizon as you wake. The damp earth of your small cottage's dirt floor cool beneath your bare feet. There is no light except for the faint glow of early morning creeping through the cracks in the modern straw walls of your home. Your cottage is small, dimly lit by a solitary window, and even that offers little relief from the thick, heavy air. The walls are thick with the scent of dampness, the moisture of the earth, and the remnants of last night's fire. It's the only warmth you have now. The hearth is cold and unused for the most part, except when there's enough wood to spare. You can see your breath in the air, though the warmth of the day is coming. This is the reality of peasant life in revolutionary France. Your life is defined by survival, and every day is a battle against the elements. You have never known anything different, not really. The stone, the mud, the hay, these are the materials of your life. They form the boundaries of your world. The cottage is your refuge, but it is far from the bustling cities of Paris where ideas of liberty and equality are stirring. Far from the revolutionary talk that fills the streets of Paris. You may have heard whispers of revolution, the fall of the Bastille, the storming of the Tuileries, but to you, it seems distant, abstract. These events belong to others, to those who are far removed from your daily struggles. For you, life is a matter of getting by, of surviving long enough to see the next season. The cottage is humble, a single room, perhaps a loft for the children to sleep in, but nothing more than a crude shelter. The walls are made of mud and straw, bound together with a rope of twine, and the floor is uneven earth that feels like it shifts beneath your feet. There are cracks in the walls where the cold drafts of early mornings seep in, and when it rains, you can hear the steady drip, drip, drip of water coming through the roof. The roof is a patchwork of thatch, filled with gaps, and the slats of the walls are thin and worn from years of wear. The hearth sits in the center of the room, stone cold, only a faint memory of the heat it once provided. There is a smell here, too, a combination of damp earth, stale air, and the lingering scent of unwashed bodies. A faint, unsettling odor of decay seems to linger in the air, perhaps it's the constant moisture or the mold that quietly grows along the corners of the cottage. It's the smell of a home that cannot keep up with the constant need for maintenance. You move across the cold floor, your feet sinking into the dirt, and take a deep breath of the morning air. You step outside, the fresh scent of the morning dew mixed with the staleness of the earth. The sky is thick with the soft hues of early dawn, a pale wash of colors that look faint against the gray and brown of the world around you. The land stretches out before you in a vast expanse, broken and cracked, like the landscape of your mind. The land is tired. The once fertile soil that sustained your ancestors is no longer kind. The fields of grain and the sparse vegetable plots that you have been given to till have been poorly tended over the years, showing the scars of failed harvests and inadequate care. You can already see it this morning, the fallow soil, the dry patches, the wilting plants that once held the promise of food. Even as the sun rises, you already feel the weight of the day ahead, another day of unrelenting labor, another day of unpredictable hunger. This is the rhythm of your life. The earth is as unforgiving as the world around you. Every season you wonder if you'll have enough. Enough to feed your children, enough to pay the king's taxes, enough to make it through the coming winter. The humble tools you have are little more than relics, old, worn, and barely functional. You have no plow, only a wooden hoe that has been sharpened just enough to work the soil. The carts you use are cracked from years of constant wear, their wheels creaking with each rotation. The animals, a pair of oxen, a few chickens, perhaps, are in better shape than the tools, though not by much. The oxen are thin, their ribs showing through their coats, as tired as you are from the constant work. Every morning you rise early and feed them, but the food you give them is never enough. You spend hours in the fields, bending over, your back sore and your hands rough. The work feels endless, constant, unrelenting. Planting, harvesting, weeding, the labor is never done, but the rewards are scarce. You look up at the sky, hoping for rain, hoping for relief, but the weather is no more generous than the land. The sun beats down like a hammer, burning your skin, drying the earth, making the labor even harder. And when the rain finally comes, it is too little, too late. It feels like the earth itself is slowly giving up. There is no closeness to the work in the fields. It is not a community of people, it is a lonely, isolating existence. You work alone, often alongside your family, but even they are distant. The bonds that should hold you together have been frayed over the years by the tension of constant survival. You are isolated physically and emotionally. The village you live in is small, a cluster of mud huts and a few stone houses, but even here, you do not feel like you are part of the world that exists beyond your farm. The closeness of your neighbors once a small comfort has been replaced by suspicion, the fear of denunciation, the fear that anyone could be watched or accused of supporting the revolution or opposing the monarchy, has created a quiet rift between families. You work, you live, but the closeness that once existed has vanished. As the day stretches on, the weight of the sun and the endless labor presses upon you. By noon your body is drenched in sweat, your clothes sticking to your back. The dull, burning ache of your limbs becomes a constant companion. You can feel the heat in the air, an oppressive, suffocating heat that makes it impossible to escape. The food you carry with you, a loaf of stale bread, a small chunk of cheese, some dried herbs, barely provides relief. There is no luxury, no comfort, in this life. Meanwhile, Paris, the center of the revolution, the place of change, of ideals, is far away. The promises of liberty, equality, and fraternity are just that, promises. They feel distant, unimportant. You can hear them on the rare occasions when someone passes through the village, but they mean little to you. The hunger in your stomach, the weariness in your bones, the tax collector's impending visit, these are real. These are the things that define your existence. The revolution may roar in Paris, but here, it feels like a world apart, almost like a dream. Liberty and equality are not things that will help you grow enough crops to survive. The only thing that matters is whether the next harvest will feed your family, or if another year of famine will leave you struggling to make it through. Even as you work, there is a strange echo of the past. The landscape, the labor, the separation from everything else. It feels like you are living in a world that is part of something much older than the revolution. It's a world that hasn't changed. Not really, even though the world outside is in upheaval. The voices of the revolution are louder in the cities, but they barely reach you in the fields. You continue your work, feeling isolated, feeling as though the world is passing you by. And with each turn of the soil, each plodding step of the oxen, you wonder if anything will ever change. The day begins long before the sun rises, with the cold earth beneath your feet and the faint sound of birds outside your window. The dim light of early morning barely reaches your cottage, but you are already awake. The day has already begun, whether you are ready or not. You stretch your stiff limbs, the aches from yesterday's labor still lingering in your muscles. Every movement feels like a reminder of the backbreaking work that lies ahead. There is no time for rest, no time for recovery. The work must continue, or there will be nothing to show for it, nothing to feed your family, nothing to pay the king's taxes, and nothing to hold back the threat of hunger. You step outside, your bare feet meeting the cold, uneven soil. The air is crisp, but already you can feel the weight of the day's labor pressing in on you. The sun is still hidden behind the horizon, but the promise of heat is already there, heavy and oppressive. The land is both your burden and your livelihood, and you are tethered to it in ways that go beyond simple survival. Your hands are rough and calloused from years of work, but the tools you have to tend the land are old, worn down from years of use and neglect. A wooden hoe, cracked from repeated use, is your most reliable tool, though even it is a poor substitute for the sharp, clean plows used by the rich, who never touch the earth with their own hands. Your shoes are mere rags, worn thin from walking the fields, the soles so thin that you can feel every stone beneath you. But you press on. There is no other choice. The day ahead is a repeat of countless others. The fields await, stretching in all directions, a patchwork of fallow land, crops struggling to grow, and the bare patches where nothing will ever grow. The rhythm of the day is set. Plant, tend, harvest. It is a cycle that never changes, a pattern carved into the land by your labor. But even in this cycle, there is no rest. You begin by preparing the soil, digging and turning over the earth, feeling the rough texture of the soil beneath your hands. It is often dry, cracked, and parched from lack of water, but sometimes it is too wet, thick with the stagnant scent of decay and rotting crop remains. The cycle of planting and harvesting is always imperfect, and with every season that passes, the land feels less fertile, less forgiving. The tools you have only make the work harder, forcing you to bend lower, work longer, and push harder than any peasant should. You set to work, the sharp smell of sweat quickly mingling with the dirt as you dig into the earth. Your body is already tired from yesterday's work, but you cannot stop. The sun begins to climb above the horizon, its heat already penetrating the land, warming the soil but also draining your energy. The sweat quickly soaks into your shirt, making it cling to your skin as the hours drag on. The muscles in your arms, your back, and your legs ache with every movement. You feel the strain in your lower back, the steady grinding of your bones as you work the earth each movement, reminding you of the painful toll this life takes on your body. The land is not kind to you. The plows are worn, and the oxen, if you have any, are weak, their ribs showing through their coats, their muscles to ache from the long days of pulling the plow through the soil, and even they know that the work will never end. The tools are rudimentary, nothing like the steel plows used by the wealthy, but this is all you have. You force the plow through the soil, feeling the jolt with each push, each tug. Your hands are raw and sore, but you keep at it. There is no other way to survive. As the morning passes into the heat of midday, you feel the sun's intensity. The heat presses down on you, the air thick and suffocating with dust. Your skin is already sunburned, raw from the exposure, and the sweat runs down your face, stinging your eyes. You pause for a moment to wipe the sweat from your brow, but there is no respite. The work must continue. The land must be tilled, the seed must be planted, or the cycle will fail. You kneel to sow the seeds, the small grains slipping between your fingers as you scatter them across the earth. The grains are small, fragile, and the hope of a successful crop is always uncertain. You hope for rain, but you cannot depend on it. The weather is fickle, and droughts and floods often destroy your best efforts. The seeds you plant today may not sprout, or if they do, they may not grow enough to sustain your family. The wind picks up, a dry, harsh breeze that stirs the soil and makes the seeds settle unevenly. You can already feel the anxiety settling in. Will these seeds grow? Will they survive? Will there be enough? By mid-afternoon, the fatigue is overwhelming. Your body is aching, and the hunger in your stomach is gnawing at you, relentless. There is no real lunch, only what little you can scrape together, perhaps some stale bread, maybe a turnip if you're lucky. The hunger is always there, a constant companion. Your stomach is empty, and yet you keep going, knowing that tomorrow's work will be even more exhausting. The sun begins to dip, casting long shadows across the fields as you continue your work. The heat of the day begins to ease, but the exhaustion is all-encompassing. Your hands are sore, your back is bent, and your mind is weary from the constant pressure of survival. There is no rest. There is no relief. You've worked from dawn, and now as the day fades, you're still at it, still pressing forward. The tax collector's visit looms in the back of your mind, though you try not to think of it. He will come soon, demanding his share of what little you've grown, what little you've earned from this endless labor. The idea of having to give up even more, to surrender your hard-earned grain and food, fills you with a sense of hopelessness. What will you feed your family? Where will the money come from to pay the king's taxes? You know you have no choice but to comply, even though it feels like the last thread of your survival is slipping away. Finally, as night falls and you stand over the fallow fields, exhausted and empty, the only thing that remains is the silence. The day is over, but your labor is never truly done. The sun sets on another fruitless day, and the only comfort you can take is the knowledge that you made it through. Tomorrow, the cycle begins again. The earth feels heavy beneath your feet as you walk towards the fields, but there is something else weighing on you, something far more oppressive than the soil or the labor. The day stretches before you, full of the same work you do every day, planting, tending, hoping, but there is always that constant shadow lurking in the back of your mind, the looming tax collector's visit. The collector will come, and with him, the crushing burden of the tail, the and every other tax that bleeds your survival dry. As a peasant, you own very little, perhaps a small plot of land, maybe a few animals, a cow or a couple of oxen, some chickens. These meager possessions are your livelihood, your only hope for food, your only source of income. But even these humble belongings are not truly yours. They are tied to the whims of the land and the heavy hand of taxation. The tail, a land tax, is a constant weight on your shoulders, one that you cannot avoid. No matter how barren the fields may be, no matter how little you manage to grow. Imagine this. After a particularly harsh winter, the spring harvest fails. The rains never come, the seeds you sowed rot in the ground, and the crops you've worked so tirelessly for wither and die. Your family goes hungry, but your obligations remain. The tail, the land tax, will still be due. You must pay your share whether you have the grain to spare or not. Even if the fields remain fallow, you are expected to provide the same tribute to the crown. There is no mercy. There is no understanding of your struggles. The tax collectors come, their visit a terrifying certainty. They take what little you have, leaving you with even less. The two demands its share of your labor. This is a forced labor tax. The requirement to work on public projects, building roads, maintaining bridges, or performing other duties that benefit the kingdom. You work not for pay, but for your obligation to the crown. It is a hard, unforgiving tax, one that drains your strength and time. Time that could be spent cultivating your land or feeding your family, yet you have no choice. The king demands it, and your family's survival hinges on your ability to work. The imbalance of it all becomes more apparent with each passing year. What you own, what little you have to call your own, is no match for what you owe. A piece of land, just a small plot that barely yields enough to feed your family, is taxed more than the grand estates of the nobles who live far away. They are exempt from the burden that weighs you down. They own vast stretches of land, but they pay little or nothing compared to you. They live in luxury, while you live in constant fear of losing everything. The clergy, too, are not exempt from the system. They live in grand abbeys and churches, but their obligations to the crown are minimal at best. The church demands its tithe, but the clergy itself is rarely held to the same standards as the peasants. They own land, often vast tracts of it, yet their wealth is shielded by the sacred cloak of the church. The wealth of the church is vast, yet the peasant pays, the poor pay. The very institutions that claim to protect the soul are the ones that contribute to the endless burden on your family. And so, as you return to your small plot of land, the weight of these taxes presses down on you like the very soil you are trying to cultivate. The land that should be your refuge, your means of survival, has become a tool of exploitation. Your humble animals, the oxen and chickens you depend on for your livelihood, are also not safe. They, too, are taxed, their value drained by the needs of the crown. Nothing is truly yours. Even your labor, which you offer freely to the land, is constantly claimed by the demands of the monarchy. The tax collector's visit is an event that looms over you every day, a slow, suffocating dread that builds in your chest. You never know exactly when he will come, but you know he will come soon. He arrives with his men, their faces set in stone, their eyes cold and detached from the life you live. The collector's presence is a silent terror that spreads through the village. You are not alone in your fear. Every peasant in the village lives under the same threat. The feeling of dread is palpable when the collector's men appear on the horizon, their black coats rippling in the wind like a dark cloud. They come to claim your share, no matter how little you have left. As they approach, you feel a tightness in your chest. You have nothing left to offer. You've already given so much more than you should have had to give. What will they take next? The thought of losing everything, your land, your animals, your future fills you with an icy dread. You have worked so hard, yet all of it is at the mercy of a system that seems designed to strip you of whatever meager resources you manage to scrape together. The wealthy landowners, the noblemen who live so far away, rarely feel the pinch of these taxes. They are far removed from the realities of peasant life. But for you, the burden never ends. The tax collector's arrival is the final blow in a series of losses that have been slowly draining the life from your land, your family, and your spirit. It's not just the physical toll of the labor. It's the knowledge that, no matter how hard you work, no matter how much you sacrifice, the system will always claim more than you can give. The collector leaves with what little you have, his bags weighed down with your hard-earned grain, your livestock, your sweat. When he leaves, there's nothing left. No food, no hope, only the emptiness of the land stretching out before you. You return to the work, to the endless cycle of labor and taxation. Your mind is heavy with the thought of the future. How much longer can you survive under this strain? How much longer can you work before the land refuses to yield? You fear that soon, you will have nothing to offer at all. The taxes will remain no matter how little you have to give. The cycle continues, and you remain trapped in it. The day stretches long and heavy in the fields, but as the sun dips below the horizon, there is no sense of satisfaction in the day's labor. The hunger gnaws at your stomach, a constant, insistent reminder of how little you have, of how little there is to sustain your family. The fields may be barren, the grain scarce, but it's the empty cupboards that truly weigh on your mind. You know that tomorrow, as you return to the same routine of sowing, tending, and praying for rain, the empty bowls on the table will still be there, staring back at you. There will be nothing in them, and the desperate hunger that has become a constant companion will continue to plague you. The bread that sustains you, if it can be called sustenance, is stale, its texture dry and unpleasant. It's all you can afford, and it is not enough. The grain you've managed to grow this season is barely enough to feed your family through the winter, but even that is being drained away by taxes. The bread shortage that has swept through France is not just an inconvenience, it is a crisis. The cost of bread has skyrocketed beyond the reach of the common people, leaving the poorest like you scrambling for whatever scraps they can find. Inflation makes the already meager provisions even more unattainable. The wheat prices climb higher with each passing day, and even if you could afford a loaf of bread, it would be far smaller than what you would have had in years past. The land is dry, and the crops that are supposed to give you hope, the rye, the barley, the oats, are sparse. You can feel it when you touch the soil. It's no longer the rich, fertile earth it once was. The lack of rain has left the land cracked. The crops wilted before they could even begin to thrive. The warmth of the sun now seems like an enemy, draining the moisture from the ground, leaving your crops gasping for life. The blight that has swept through the fields of France is not just a hardship, it is a devastation. What was once your hope, your very survival, is now little more than dust, and the taxes on your land remain unchanged. You must still pay the tale, regardless of whether your crops thrive or wither. As you stand in the doorway of your cottage, your heart heavy with the weight of the day, you watch as your children play in the dirt, their thin faces staring up at you with hungry eyes. They are thin, their ribs visible beneath their clothes. The empty bowls sit on the table, and your wife begins preparing the small meal you can offer: a few scraps of stale bread, perhaps a handful of vegetables from the garden if they're lucky. The soup, when there is any, is watery, thin, and unsatisfying. You can hear the constant murmurs of hunger as they wait for their portion. But even that meager portion is threatened. Rumors of stolen grain swirl through the village: grain hoarded by merchants, grain stolen by thieves, and even grain seized by local officials. The grain that should feed the village is being taken from under their noses, making the scarcity even worse. People are starving, and there is no one to turn to. Desperation hangs thick in the air. You hear stories of food being stolen from carts, families bartering for scraps, and desperate individuals resorting to stealing just to keep their children from crying out in hunger. The hunger is not just physical, it is a gnawing, deep emptiness that takes root in the soul, a relentless reminder of how fragile life has become. As the winter months drag on, the situation only worsens. The cold creeps into the bones, and the hunger becomes excruciating. Even the small reserves of food you had carefully set aside for the winter are now dwindling. What was meant to last you through the cold months will not stretch any further. The cabbage and potatoes you have grown are the only things left to sustain you, and they are being eaten faster than you can grow them. Rationing becomes the only way to survive, but you know it's unsustainable. Your body is weakened by hunger, your strength sapped, and yet you continue to work the fields, knowing that the food you need is not there, and that the next harvest may be just as poor as the one before. You feel it in your muscles, the aching fatigue of a body that has been underfed, that has been drained by the constant labor of a life that offers no respite. Your hands are raw, your back bent from labor, but it's the hunger that weighs on you the most. It's the gnawing emptiness that takes over your every thought. There is nothing to fill the void. No bread, no meat, no hope. The days blur together, one indistinguishable from the next, a haze of hunger and exhaustion. Each meal, if you can even call it that, is a struggle. The tension in your stomach reminds you constantly that there is never enough. The fear of starvation grows stronger with each passing day. You hear of other villages, where people have died from malnutrition, where families have been reduced to eating their livestock just to stay alive. Neighbors are forced to borrow grain or barter whatever they can, but even that is becoming harder and harder to come by. There is no security, no promise of relief. You live in a world where the land refuses to yield and the government takes more than it gives. The cold of winter presses harder, the nights grow longer, and the hunger deepens. Your family suffers, and you can do nothing to ease their pain. Even the simple pleasures of a meal, what should be a moment of nourishment, or diminished, turned into a ritual of deprivation. What used to be enough to sustain you is no longer enough at all. The sensation of hunger becomes a constant companion. Your stomach twists in on itself, but you try not to let your children see the extent of it. You try to make what little food you have last longer, but there is only so much that can be done. You can only ration what you have left, but the fear of going hungry tomorrow never leaves your mind. There is no escaping it. The desperation of hunger grips you more tightly as the days pass, and even though you continue to labor, to sow seeds, and to wait for the promise of spring, you know that the harvest will come with its own set of hardships, whether the land yields or not. As the months pass, the once simple rhythm of peasant life is interrupted by an ever-growing sense of unease. The steady hum of the land, the quiet of the fields, the unbroken patterns of dawn to dusk seas, all seem overshadowed now by something darker, more insidious. While you are working in the fields, the sounds of the revolution ripple through the air, reaching even the most isolated corners of rural France. There is talk in the village, whispers of changes in the air. But it is not the promises of liberty or the cries for equality that fill your thoughts. It is the growing fear that even the most innocent act can be twisted, can be seen as disloyalty or subversion. The revolution may have begun in Paris, but it has stretched its tendrils far beyond the city walls. Even here, in the quiet of your cottage, you feel its reach. The rumors reach you, always. The suspicion of being watched or reported begins to eat away at your peace. You no longer trust your neighbors, even though you once worked beside them in the fields, shared bread with them. Suspicion has replaced solidarity, and fear has become a part of everyday life. The days of simple survival have been replaced by the unease of never knowing who might be listening, who might be watching. You have heard the stories, the ones whispered late at night when the village is supposed to be asleep. Stories of people who disappeared, who were taken from their homes in the middle of the night, never to be seen again. Some say they were counter-revolutionaries. Others say they were just unlucky, caught in the web of fear that stretches out like a spider's web throughout the land. But one thing is clear, no one is safe. The revolution's reach is not confined to the grand halls of Paris. It has crept into every home, every field, every village. The local authorities, the militia, the neighborhood watch have become an omnipresent force. Once they were just figures in the background, distant and removed, but now, they are everywhere. They are watching, they are listening, and most frightening of all, they are reporting. The militia, which once helped protect the village from bandits or troublemakers, now holds unprecedented power. They are not there to ensure peace or order, they are there to enforce the revolutionary ideals, to root out anyone suspected of being a threat to the cause. The neighborhood watch, once a casual affair, is now a paranoia-fueled system of surveillance. Neighbors who once helped one another with crops, who shared meals, now watch each other with a nervous eye. A stolen glance, a word said too loudly in passing, could be misinterpreted, could be enough to earn someone a report. If you complain about the rising prices of bread, if you speak too openly about the hunger that haunts your family, you risk being labeled as disloyal, as someone who is not truly committed to the revolution. Anyone could be watching, anyone could be listening. Even a small, innocent mistake like mentioning the nobility's privileges can be twisted into something dangerous. The fear of neighbors becomes the most oppressive thing you face in this new world. Once, there was a trust in the community, a quiet understanding that everyone shared in the hardships. But now, every interaction is tainted with the knowledge that someone might be ready to report you. You cannot trust even those who once shared bread with you, those who once worked alongside you in the fields. Self-preservation is the new rule of the day. Ideological zeal has replaced camaraderie. You hear whispers from other villagers, voices anxious and low, talking about the need to defend the revolution, to root out traitors. Those who once fed you, helped you with harvest, now are afraid to look at you for too long, afraid that their gaze will make them guilty by association. The fear of being accused becomes all-encompassing. The revolutionary fervor that spreads through the streets of Paris where people shout about liberty and equality has its consequences. It is not just the wealthy or the clergy who are in danger. It is everyone. A slight misstep, a wrong word, and you could find yourself under suspicion. The idea of being reported, being accused of being a counter-revolutionary is something you now live with daily. There is no room for doubt or hesitation. There is no room for compassion. The revolution demands loyalty, absolute and unyielding. And anyone suspected of disloyalty will face the full wrath of the new order. In the back of your mind, there is the growing, relentless terror of what might happen to you if you are accused. The guillotine in Paris has become a symbol of the revolution's power, a stark reminder of the fate that awaits those who are unlucky enough to be labeled as enemies of the state. The terror that has gripped Paris has spread throughout the land, a virus that infects every village, every town, every person. The guillotine was once seen as an execution device for the aristocracy, but now, it has become a tool for mass death, used to rid the country of any perceived threats. You hear the rumors, the whispers, stories of people, common folk, peasants who were taken in the dead of night, accused of being traitors, of being disloyal to the revolution. They were arrested, paraded before the courts, and sent to the guillotine before they could even speak in their defense. The revolution, it seems, is a double-edged sword. It promises freedom, equality, fraternity, but it also brings with it the constant threat of death for those who are too outspoken, too unfortunate, or too unlucky to be spared. The guillotine is no longer just a tool of execution. It is a symbol of fear, a constant reminder that the revolution is not just about ideals, but about power, control, and absolute loyalty. And even in the countryside, far from the guillotine's shadow, the terror of Paris spreads like wildfire. The guillotine's cold blade hangs over every interaction, over every conversation, every exchange of words. The revolutionary tribunal in Paris may be miles away, but its influence reaches everywhere. You cannot escape the fear. It is in the air you breathe, in the looks your neighbors give you, in the words you speak. Every moment is filled with the tension of not knowing who might be watching, who might be listening. Nothing is safe, not even your own thoughts. Even the smallest slip-up, even the tiniest suggestion of disloyalty, could be your undoing. You wonder how much longer you can live like this. The revolution that promised so much has turned into a silent war, a war of suspicion and paranoia. The guillotine in Paris may seem far away, but it feels closer with each passing day. The terror that began in the cities is now part of your world, part of your life. Everyone is a suspect now, and anyone could be dragged into the increasing web of surveillance. Loyalty is demanded, and survival depends on the shifting sands of ideology. The day begins as it always does, early, too early. The rooster's crow stirs you from fitful sleep, but sleep offers no real rest. Your bones ache before you even rise, and your muscles are tight from the endless labor of yesterday. The thought of facing another long day with nothing but the same relentless tasks fills you with a sense of dread that settles deep in your chest. Your body tells you to rest, but your responsibilities demand you rise. There is no time for recovery in the life of a peasant. Rest is a luxury you can't afford. The sun is barely up, and already the work has begun. The ground beneath your feet is muddy and uneven, making every step feel like a struggle. The dirt sticks to your feet, even as you walk the few steps out of your cottage. You feel it already, the weight of the world pressing down on your shoulders, your back bent from years of toil. Every step feels like trudging through mud, dragging an invisible weight that grows heavier with each day. There is no escape from this life, no way out of the cycle of labor, hunger, and taxation that binds you. You have been taught that if you work hard enough, if you sacrifice enough, things will get better. But you've learned the hard way that this is a lie. You will work, yes, but the fruits of your labor will never be enough to fill your stomach or your soul. The soil that you once saw as a means of survival now feels like an enemy. It is stubborn, unforgiving, and dry in some places, waterlogged in others. You've worked it until your hands are raw, until your body aches from bending over day after day. Your tools are worn and rusted, and even the simplest task, tilling the land, becomes an exhausting battle. With every stroke of the hoe or every turn of the plow, you feel the physical toll it takes. But it is the mental burden that wears you down the most. There is no end. There is no relief in sight. Even when you plant your seeds, there is no guarantee that they will grow, and even if they do, there's no certainty that you will be able to harvest enough to feed your family, let alone pay the taxes. You have heard the stories, the promises of liberty, equality, and fraternity, whispers of a new world where everyone is free, where the burden of feudalism is lifted, where everyone has a voice. But as you trudge through the dirt, working tirelessly to keep your family alive, these promises feel like a distant dream, something that belongs to others, to those far removed from the harshness of your life. In the cities, the revolution rages. In the fields, it seems a mere whisper. Liberty is a word you hear only in passing, and equality feels like a far-off promise that will never reach you. Fraternity is a hollow concept when you have no one to lean on except the burden of your own survival. The truth is, the revolution has changed little for you. The idealism of the cities feels empty out here, where your hands are stained with dirt and your eyes are heavy with exhaustion. You hear the stories of the Declaration of the Rights of Man, the cries for equality and freedom, but in your world, nothing has shifted. You are still tied to the land, still bound by taxes, still chained by the cycle of work and hunger. The nobles are free, untouched by the harsh realities of your life, while you, the ones who feed the nation, are still trapped by the land you toil for. The sense of powerlessness is suffocating. You can feel it in the heaviness of your steps, in the tiredness in your bones, in the endless ache in your hands. You dream of change, of a world where your children will not have to suffer the same fate as you, where they will not be bound to the same land, the same unrelenting labor. But those dreams are fragile, fleeting things easily broken by the reality of hunger. The dream of equality fades with each passing day, each failure to fill the grain bins, each empty bowl. You have heard of the guillotine in Paris, but here, in the fields, it is not the blade you fear, is the hunger that threatens to consume you. As you bend low to the earth, you feel it, the weight of despair. You cannot escape the system that keeps you trapped. The taxes remain, no matter how little you have, no matter how much you struggle. The seigneur still takes his share, even when the harvest fails. The crops may be poor, but the demand for tribute does not change. You work, you toil, you suffer, and still, it is never enough. Everything you do feels pointless, as though the system is designed to keep you in your place, to ensure that no matter how hard you try, you will never break free. The constant hunger is the worst part. It gnaws at you from the inside, reminding you constantly of your inadequacy. Even when you gather the last of the food from your fields, there is no sense of satisfaction, only a fleeting relief that quickly fades as the hunger returns. You can barely feel your body anymore. It is just an instrument of survival, a vessel for the endless cycle of work. Your muscles ache, your eyes burn with the fatigue of long hours, but there is no time for rest. There is no escape from the endless toil. And then, the hunger sets in again. You can feel it in the pit of your stomach, a gnawing emptiness that never quite goes away. The scent of stale bread fills your nostrils, a bitter reminder of the meager rations you have. You ration what little you have, but it is never enough. The pain of hunger makes it impossible to focus, impossible to think clearly. You can only think of food, of what you will eat next, but there is nothing left. The fear that grips you now is not the fear of the revolution or the guillotine, but the fear that there will be no tomorrow, no future to hope for. The bitter reality of survival is this: you can only dream of freedom, of liberty, but those dreams remain unreachable, distant, abstract. The revolution's ideals are beautiful words spoken in far-off cities, in grand speeches, but they are of little use here. The laborers who grow the food are left behind, invisible in the shadow of the revolution's grand promises. Liberty is an empty word when you are starving, when your children cry out for food, when your back aches from endless labor, when your soul is drained by the constant fear of what tomorrow might bring. You continue the labor, day after day. The plow digs deep into the earth, but it seems to make no difference. The seeds are planted, but they may never sprout. You hear of the freedom the revolution promises, but it feels unreal, like something meant for others, not for people like you. Survival is the only thing that matters now. And in this struggle for survival, you begin to wonder if the revolution was ever meant for you at all. The weight of another long day's labor is upon you, and with it, the slow, heavy rhythm of the seasons that never cease. The fields remain barren, the hunger ever present, and the hope of change feels like a distant memory, fading like the fleeting glow of the sunset. Another year passes, and the cycle continues, one of grinding survival, where each day blends into the next. And the quiet suffering of peasants like you is largely unnoticed, unheard. The revolution promised you a different world, one of freedom and equality, but from this place, in the mud and dust of your land, those promises seem empty. The clamor of the cities, the shouting and marching of the revolutionaries in Paris, feels like an abstract dream that never touched the earth you toil upon. It is a world that exists only in distant words, whispered in town squares or carried by messengers. But it does not seem to make its way to your village, to your fields, or to your family's table. Yet, even in the furrows of your labor, you cannot ignore the tremors of change in the air. The news filters in, brought by travelers, by soldiers passing through, or by the whispers of traders who've visited the capital. You hear talk of liberty, equality, and the heady promises of a new order. You hear of the fall of the Bastille, the tumble of the monarchy, and the grand speeches of Robespierre and his followers. You can almost feel the tremors of that revolutionary fervor in your bones, even if the fruits of it never seem to touch your own land. You dream of a day when the promises made to the people will come to fruition, but in the back of your mind, you know there is a darker side to the revolution, a side that threatens everything you have, even your life. As you turn the soil again, feeling the familiar ache in your back, your mind drifts. You wonder what it would be like if you, too, could take part in the changes sweeping through the cities. You've heard the stories of Robespierre, the man who rallied the revolution, whose words stirred the hearts of thousands. And yet, his rise to power came not with the gentle winds of progress, but with the violent gusts of fear and distrust, even in the distant corners of the countryside. You've heard about the reign of terror, the wave of bloodshed that has taken hold of Paris. You've heard whispers of the guillotine, a tool that has become a symbol not just of justice, but of fear. It is no longer just the aristocracy or the nobles who face the blade, but everyone who is accused of subversion, disloyalty, or even suspicion. The promise of liberty now feels suffocated beneath the weight of paranoia. The revolution, which promised to lift the burden of the poor, has instead cast a shadow of terror over the land. It is as though the very ideals of equality and freedom have been hijacked by the insidious forces of fear and control. In Paris, the streets are alive with the sound of accusations and the clanging of the guillotine, and even from afar you can feel its chilling effects. You've heard of neighbors being arrested for the slightest hint of disloyalty, of the smallest of gestures being twisted into treason. The very air seems to vibrate with the tension of whispers and suspicion. The revolution, which promised to free you from the chains of an old, corrupt system, now seems to have created a new set of chains, ones that are even harder to break, for they are invisible, lurking in the shadows of every action, every word, every glance. The very freedom you were promised is now tied to anxiety, the fear of being watched, the fear of being reported. The revolutionary ideals that should have been a beacon of hope now feel like a burden. It seems the more you hear about the new France, the more you realize that the old ways may not be as distant as you hoped. Instead of liberation, you feel trapped in a new system, one built not on equality, but on control. The reign of terror unfolds like a dark storm over the land, and the seeds of fear take root in your heart. It feels as though the guillotine's blade could fall at any moment, on anyone, regardless of who they are. You've heard the stories of neighbors dragged from their homes in the middle of the night, accused of counter-revolutionary activity, only to be executed within hours. You hear rumors of whole families being wiped out for speaking against the government, for showing even the smallest sign of resistance. The guillotine, a symbol of justice, has become a tool of mass fear. Those who should have been the first to be liberated from the old system are now faced with a new terror. The stories from Paris are enough to make you shudder. You've heard about the accusations that fly through the air, often without evidence, often without reason. You hear about the revolutionary tribunal, where anyone can be tried and sentenced to death without a fair hearing. The ideas of liberty, equality, and brotherhood now seem like words abstract and distant compared to the reality of terror that surrounds you. The revolution you hoped for, one that would lift the burden from your shoulders, has turned into a nightmare. Every word, every glance, every action could be misinterpreted. Every day, you wonder whether you, too, could be accused, could be dragged into the madness and lose everything. As the spring turns to summer, you hear more about the events unfolding in Paris. The reign of terror grows more intense. With Robespierre at the helm, his paranoia growing ever stronger. The guillotine continues to claim lives, and even the slightest sign of dissent is enough to get a person branded as a traitor. The guillotine's blade has become a symbol of fear for everyone, from the wealthiest aristocrats to the poorest peasant. No one is safe from its reach, and no one can escape the web of suspicion that now governs everything. The revolution, which was supposed to bring about justice, now seems to bring only death and despair. The ideals that once seemed so noble, so full of promise, now lie broken in the streets, drenched in the blood of those who were executed. The great cry for liberty, for freedom, has become something else entirely, a weapon of control, used to crush anyone who dares to question the new order. The terror that has taken over the cities of France has spread like a virus, infecting not just the elite, but the very heart of the revolution itself. And yet you are far from the heart of it all. In the fields, in your humble cottage, you are still left out of the revolutionary promise. The promises of freedom and equality still feel like distant echoes, like an abstract idea that never reaches the dust-covered roads of your land. Liberty was supposed to be for everyone, but it's not. Equality was supposed to be for the poor, the hungry, but it's not. All you have now is the terrible reality of living in a world where anyone can be accused, where anyone, even a peasant like you, could find themselves caught up in the fear and bloodshed of the reign of terror. Maximilien Robespierre's name became synonymous with the French Revolution, but his path to becoming its central figure was not one of immediate power or fame. Born in 1758 in Arras, Robespierre was, in his early life, a lawyer, a young idealistic man known for his eloquence, a staunch defender of democracy and equality. His reputation for integrity and his unwavering commitment to the principles of the Enlightenment earned him a place in the National Assembly during the early days of the Revolution. In a time when radical change was sweeping across France, Robespierre positioned himself as a firm advocate for the common people, and his speeches were filled with a passion for justice that resonated deeply with those longing for a more equal society. From the outset, Robespierre was not just another voice in the Assembly. He quickly became one of the more notable figures, rising through the ranks with a steady commitment to principle that many admired. He was often referred to as the Incorruptible, a title that reflected both his personal integrity and his apparent unshakable belief in the purity of the revolution. In the early years of the Revolution, Robespierre advocated for the abolition of the monarchy, the establishment of universal male suffrage, and the protection of the people from tyranny. Proposals that aligned perfectly with the aspirations of a nation teetering on the edge of radical change. Yet, despite his reputation for fairness and idealism, Robespierre's rise was not without its dark undercurrents. Even in the early years, ambition and a desire for power lurked beneath the surface of his public persona. The ideals that he espoused, freedom, equality, fraternity, were appealing. But Robespierre also sought to become the leader of the new France, to control the revolution in the name of those ideals. His vision for a just society began to grow more rigid and absolute, moving from an appeal for equality to a determination to reshape society according to his own moral standards. As Robespierre gained more influence, especially within the Jacobin, the radical revolutionary group he belonged to, his views began to change. Initially, he appeared to stand for moderation within the revolution, advocating for social reforms but also expressing caution about going too far, too fast. But as the revolution progressed, especially during the year of 1793, Robespierre began to see the revolution not as a movement of gradual reform, but as a battle between the forces of virtue and corruption. He started to believe that, in order to preserve the revolution, it needed to be purged of anyone who threatened its moral purity, even if those threats were imagined or exaggerated. In June 1793, as the revolution turned more violent and radical, Robespierre's power began to peak. France was in the midst of war with multiple European powers, and the internal divisions of the revolution had begun to fester. The revolutionary government was struggling to consolidate power and control, while the counter-revolutionary movements began to rise across the country. It was during this tumultuous time that Robespierre's rhetoric began to take on a much darker tone. He called for the removal of enemies of the revolution, people whom he deemed to be traitors to the cause. In 1793, Robespierre made an essential transition in his understanding of the revolution's direction. No longer did he see it merely as an intellectual and political struggle for freedom and equality. Now it was a battle between virtue and vice, between the good and the evil that threatened the very foundation of the revolution. This change in thinking would mark the beginning of the Reign of Terror, a period that would define Robespierre's legacy, but also plunge France into its darkest days. Robespierre's belief in virtue took on a purifying quality. He began to argue that in order to preserve the revolution, the revolutionary government had to root out corruption, betrayal, and disloyalty, and that the most effective means to do so was through terror. His famous dictum, "Terror is nothing else than justice," prompt, severe, inflexible, it flows, then, from virtue, would come to define this era. It was a paradox to achieve virtue, Robespierre argued. Fear had to be employed, a constant vigilance against the perceived threats to the ideals of the revolution. In his mind, the violence of the terror was justified, even necessary, in order to purge France of the forces that threatened the revolution's moral purity. The Revolutionary Tribunal, created in March 1793, was one of the first steps in turning Robespierre's philosophy into a mechanism of mass repression. The tribunal was designed to prosecute those accused of being enemies of the revolution, but it soon became a tool of totalitarian control. Robespierre believed that those who doubted the revolution or questioned its progress were enemies, whether they were royalists, nobles, or even fellow revolutionaries who had become too moderate. He saw the guillotine as the final arbiter of justice, not merely for those accused of treason, but for anyone deemed to be a threat to revolutionary virtue. The language of justice quickly became intertwined with violence. Robespierre's speeches grew more ruthless and militant as he justified the need for terror to ensure the survival of the revolution. His justification for violence was rooted in his belief that virtue was not just a moral stance, but a political tool that needed to be defended by whatever means necessary. But the violence didn't stop at aristocrats or royal sympathizers. As the terror grew, any dissent, no matter how small or subjective, was enough to earn a death sentence. A neighbor might be accused of counter-revolutionary thought for a whispered complaint about the lack of bread. A former ally could be denounced for shifting allegiances or questioning Robespierre's methods. Terror began to suffocate the very principles it was supposed to protect, turning justice into a tool of repression, and leaving the revolution's ideals to wither in its wake. Transition to tyranny. The Revolutionary Tribunal, as the heart of terror, Robespierre's firm belief that terror was necessary to safeguard the revolution, marked the transition from a revolution of liberation to one of oppression. As the Revolutionary Tribunal continued its work, it became the central mechanism by which Robespierre and his followers could eliminate any perceived enemy of the state. The tribunal, which was meant to serve the moral good of the nation, evolved into an instrument of mass surveillance and political cleansing. At the start, Robespierre and his supporters maintained a sense of noble purpose, positioning the tribunal as a necessary safeguard against counter-revolutionary forces. However, over time, the lines between guilt and innocence blurred completely. Political rivals, former allies, and even people with no apparent connection to any royalist or anti-revolutionary movements were swept into the maelstrom. The terror that was meant to preserve the revolution now consumed it. Robespierre's role within the Committee of Public Safety, which controlled the tribunal, gave him absolute power over the course of justice in France. Through his speeches and decrees, he solidified his authority over the revolution, justifying increasingly draconian measures. The tribunal became a place of fear where no one was safe, not even those who helped lead the revolution. The guillotine was used at such a rapid pace that Paris became known for its constant bloodshed. The execution lists grew longer each day as Robespierre's paranoia grew deeper. Eventually, this authoritarian rule led to internal strife within the revolutionary movement. Robespierre began to alienate former allies, particularly Danton and others who had once fought for the same ideals. His insistence on purity and radicalism alienated those who had initially supported him. Even the Jacobins, the very radicals who had brought him to power, began to turn against him. The revolution, which had begun as a movement for liberty, equality, and fraternity, had become a frightening regime of terror. Robespierre's belief in the purity of the revolution, and his view that any dissent threatened the very ideals of the state, led to a period of mass repression that left the country scarred for years to come. The guillotine became a chilling symbol of the French Revolution's reign of terror, its sharp blade an emblem of a new justice that was as swift as it was final. The mechanism, designed for efficiency and impartiality, quickly gained notoriety as the preferred method of execution during the revolution. Its design was deceptively simple, yet terrifying in its precision. A tall frame, with a sharp steel blade that would fall with unyielding force to sever the head of its victim in one clean stroke. It was a device that symbolized the radical shift in French society, where old forms of punishment were cast aside in favor of a modern, rational execution. But the guillotine also reflected the violence that was sweeping through France, an instrument of death that would become synonymous with the revolution's paranoia and bloodlust. The blade, gleaming in the sunlight, stood poised in its frame, ready to deliver its grim justice. The click of the blade as it fell, sharp and precise, was almost like a sickening a sound that struck fear into the hearts of those who gathered to witness the executions. It was the sound of finality. In the early days, the guillotine was hailed as a humane alternative to more brutal forms of execution, such as hanging or breaking on the wheel. The blade's swiftness and efficiency promised an end that was less painful than the traditional methods, an idea that became more and more ironic as the reign of terror progressed. But in the streets of Paris, where the guillotine became a constant fixture, its efficiency was less about mercy and more about its symbolic power. It became the embodiment of a political theater, a grim spectacle where crowds gathered not just to witness justice, but to watch the end of their enemies, whether those enemies were aristocrats, royalists, or even fellow revolutionaries. The guillotine wasn't just a tool of execution. It became the final act in a national drama, where the clash of ideologies was played out in a theater of violence. The crowds that gathered to witness these public executions, whether in the Place de la Concorde or in the smaller squares scattered throughout Paris, were a blend of curiosity and thrill, mingled with a growing sense of fear. The executions were no longer just a matter of justice. They had become a form of spectacle where the Revolutionary Tribunal's decisions were played out in front of a crowd that was hungry for blood, eager to see enemies of the revolution meet their end. The sense of political theater was palpable, where revolutionary ideals collided with the gory spectacle of execution, and where the guillotine served as the final statement of a society that had abandoned all notions of mercy. The first victims of the guillotine were the aristocracy, those who had long ruled France with a sense of entitlement, unaware of the discontent bubbling beneath the surface. The execution of Louis XVI in January 1793 was the symbolic starting point for the Reign of Terror. Once revered as the king, he was now condemned as a traitor to the Republic. His public execution in the Place de la Concorde was a defining moment in the revolution, marking the end of the monarchy and the beginning of a new era of violence and retribution. The execution was carried out in front of a boisterous crowd, who cheered as the king's head was severed from his body. The very man who had once held absolute power now lay dead, his blood spilled in the name of revolutionary justice. But the fall of the monarchy was just the beginning. The execution of Marie Antoinette, Louis XVI's wife, followed soon after in October 1793. The queen, who had once lived in unimaginable luxury, now stood before the guillotine as a symbol of decadence and betrayal. The crowds that gathered to witness her death were divided. Some cheered as the blade fell, while others saw her as a victim of the same forces that had consumed her husband. Her death marked the end of the royal family's reign in France, but it also marked the beginning of an era where no one, not even the powerful, not even the revolutionaries themselves, was safe. As the months passed, the guillotine's blade didn't just claim the royals, it turned on the revolutionaries themselves. Even those who had fought hardest for the revolution found themselves accused of counter-revolutionary actions, and the same blade that had executed the aristocracy now claimed the lives of former allies. The execution of Georges Danton, one of the most prominent revolutionary leaders, is perhaps the most telling example of how far the revolution had strayed from its original ideals. Danton, once a fervent supporter of the revolution, was accused of corruption and moderation and condemned to the guillotine in 1794. The sound of the blade as it fell, the cheers from the crowd, the coldness of the square, the thousands of bodies already piled high, all of these things painted a grimmer picture of the revolution's true nature. Danton, a man of the people, was now fallen, his head severed as justice became ever more blurred. The idealism of the revolution had shifted. Where once there was hope, now there was only the terrifying certainty of death for anyone who dared to question Robespierre's vision of what the revolution had become. The guillotine, in all its terrifying efficiency, became imprinted on the collective psyche of France. Its physical presence, towering above the crowds, was a symbol of the revolution's new order, an order defined by violence, by terror, by the absolute power of the state. The sharp blade, designed to sever the head with brutal precision, was part of an execution system that left little room for escape or mercy. The sensory experience of an execution was visceral and haunting. The snap of the blade, as it fell with a terrible finality, was the sound that accompanied the end of a life. The freshly severed head, once a symbol of power, now lay on the blood-soaked ground, a grotesque display of the cost of speaking against the revolution. The crowds, composed of the working-class citizens who had once fought for liberty, now jeered or cheered as the executions unfolded before them. Some came to witness the spectacle, some out of fear, others for the revolutionary catharsis that the act provided. The sound of cheers, laughter, and murmured excitement filled the air, as if the death of a man could be reduced to entertainment. In the streets, the smell of blood and sweat lingered long after the guillotine had been moved. The stale odor of decay, the stench of bodies in the hot sun, and the musk of crowded streets created an atmosphere of sickness and death. The square, filled with the clamor of the crowd, felt like a place where time itself stood still on their death. Only fear seemed to move, as the heads of noblemen, politicians, and innocents alike were carted away. The crowd grew more desensitized, their reactions increasingly violent and apathetic. The visuals of these executions, too, were horrifying. The bodies of those who had died by the blade lay in stark contrast to the once grand ideals of the revolution. Aristocrats, who had once bathed in luxury, now shared the same fate as the common people who had once been their subjugated. The execution square was a place where class distinctions melted away in the shadow of the guillotine, but the equality it promised was an equal death, not equal justice. The Revolutionary Tribunal was not just a judicial body, it was the engine behind the Reign of Terror, the institution that legitimized the widespread executions of enemies of the revolution. Created in March 1793, its purpose was to root out anyone deemed a threat to the Republic, to cleanse the nation of counter-revolutionary elements. However, the tribunal's work quickly became a bureaucratic machine, dispensing death not based on evidence but on the whims of the state. Its procedures were fast, efficient, and devoid of real justice. Trials were often briefer, few hours at most, during which the accused had little chance to defend themselves. The verdicts were predetermined, and accusations could be made by anyone, neighbor, colleague, or even a stranger. The Revolutionary Tribunal was a fear factory, designed to foster paranoia and maintain control by using the sword of justice. Once convicted, the accused were quickly sentenced to death, most often without appeal. The tribunal had the authority to execute anyone, aristocrats, royalists, revolutionaries who had lost favor, or even ordinary citizens who had expressed dissatisfaction with the direction the revolution was heading. The very purposes of the revolution were subverted as the tribunal became a tool of terror that ensured absolute conformity to Robespierre's vision. In the days following the revolution, paranoia was not just a byproduct of the violent purges, it became the very fabric of everyday life in France. The ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity, once shouted in the streets with defiance and pride, now seemed like fragile promises, easily crushed under the weight of suspicion, fear, and the insidious spread of informants. The reign of terror created an environment where no one was safe, where every whisper could be a signal of treason, and where even the most innocent glance could be misinterpreted as a sign of disloyalty to the state. The atmosphere of suspicion was pervasive, creeping into every corner of society, from the grand boulevards of Paris to the quiet villages of the countryside. In the city, the sound of whispers filled the air. Every step on the cobbled streets seemed to echo with the soft footsteps of informants ready to report anyone who spoke too freely, anyone who looked as if they were contemplating a world where the revolution's ideals weren't as sacred as they appeared. The sounds of the revolution in Paris were no longer those of joy and triumph. They were the low murmurs of a city on edge, a city where the boundary between loyalty and treachery had become almost indistinguishable. In the smaller towns and villages, the atmosphere was even more suffocating. The neighborhood watch, which once had been a method of ensuring the safety of the community, had now turned into an extension of the status system of surveillance where neighbors watched neighbors and the local militia stood ready to enforce the will of the revolutionary government. The community was divided not just between the rich and poor, but between those who were loyal to the revolution and those who, however innocently, might be deemed suspect. Everyone had become both an enforcer and a potential target. Trust, once a cornerstone of rural life, had now been replaced with a deep anxiety that permeated every conversation, every glance. In the quiet fields, where peasants worked from dawn until dusk, the low whispers of gossip about the revolution were passed along from one worker to the next. But these weren't just idle rumors, they were potential threats to the fabric of society. Perhaps someone had heard a neighbor express doubt about the purity of the revolution. Or maybe someone was criticizing the new leaders. These seemingly trivial moments, these innocent exchanges, now held the potential for ruin. There was no safe space, no sanctuary where a person could express discontent without fear of being reported. The very act of speaking out, of questioning or doubting the revolution, was seen as an act of rebellion, a rebellion that needed to be stamped out immediately. The shadows of surveillance stretched farther than any single individual could comprehend. It wasn't just the officials who kept watch over the people. Everyone became a watchful eye. Neighbors, once trusted confidants, became potential informants, eager to prove their loyalty by reporting even the smallest hint of dissent. As the revolution spiraled further into the terror, it was not only the military or official enforcers that wielded power, but the people themselves. The Revolutionary Tribunal, the backbone of the Reign of Terror, relied heavily on the reports of informants. And the Committee of Public Safety was eager to root out any enemy of the state real or imagined. In this climate, the lines between loyalty and betrayal became blurred. Informants, whether they were driven by fear, self-preservation, or ideological zeal, could destroy lives with the mere whisper of an accusation. The most terrifying part of this new culture was that anyone could become an informant, regardless of their position. The government itself encouraged the public to report anyone who seemed even remotely suspicious, offering them protection, sometimes rewards, or at least the assurance that they would not be targeted in return. Citizens who previously never imagined betraying their neighbors were compelled by fear to act. Neighbors who once shared bread, assisted with work, or consoled each other during hardships, now eyed each other with suspicion. Small, seemingly insignificant conversations could become dangerous territory. A passing remark about hunger, a comment about the price of bread, or even a sigh of exhaustion could be seen as evidence of a lack of revolutionary fervor, lack of loyalty. Those who chose silence over complicity faced their own risks. They could be seen as harboring dissent, and in this new world, even silence was suspicious. Self-preservation became the guiding principle. If you wanted to survive, you reported, you denounced. Betrayal was no longer a choice, but a matter of survival. Even close family members were not immune. Sons could report on their fathers, daughters on their mothers. The family unit, the very core of rural life, was no longer a safe haven, but a potential dangerous liability. As informants became more prevalent, The fear of being betrayed by someone you trusted was ever present. Rumors and accusations spread through villages like wildfire, with no one certain who was a true ally and who might be reporting them to the Revolutionary Tribunal. In the past, people might have taken comfort in their community working the land together, sharing meals and supporting one another. Now, that same community became a place of danger, where the risk of betrayal could come from anyone, and no one was safe. While the paranoia took root in the heart of Paris and the surrounding areas, the countryside, seemingly distant from the chaos of the capital, was not untouched by the wave of fear that gripped the nation. Peasants who lived on the land, far from the revolutionary leaders and their theories of justice, also became swept up in the terror, even though they were physically far from the central events. The village and small-town life, once defined by its rhythm of agricultural seasons and communal living, was shattered by the knowledge that even the most private thoughts could be turned into dangerous accusations. The local militias, which had once defended the village from outside invaders, now turned their attention inward. They were watching for any signs of disloyalty, looking for anyone who dared to question the government. Peasants, while still working the land, had to live in the shadow of constant scrutiny. A passing word from a neighbor, a conversation about the king, or a gesture of frustration with the situation could lead to suspicion. Everyone was expected to prove their loyalty, to show that they too were revolutionaries in spirit and deed. Even the daily interactions between peasants and their neighbors became laden with fear. Where once there was trust, now there was only anxiety. Farmers might look over their shoulders as they spoke, worried that any conversation about the drought, the famine, or the taxes might be seen as subversive. Even the quiet of the fields, once a place of contemplation and escape, became tense. As the fear of being overheard by someone loyal to the revolutionary government grew more intense, innocent conversations could quickly turn into accusations, leading to a life of endless fear and suspicion. This culture of fear extended far beyond Paris. As the revolution deepened, it was not just the city dwellers who lived under the threat of violence and death. The peasants lived in a world where their every word and action could be misinterpreted. The isolated village that had once been a safe haven, where families and neighbors shared meals and stories, now became a place where even the simplest interaction could end in betrayal. No one could be trusted, and nothing could be taken for granted. The constant fear of being watched, of being reported, was now an inseparable part of daily life. The result of all this was a society divided by paranoia and distrust, where neighbors, friends, and families became enemies, not out of hatred, but out of the instinct to survive. The revolution, which began as a movement for freedom, had morphed into something far more insidious, a society where loyalty was demanded and betrayal was rewarded. The peasant, once at the heart of the revolution's hopes, now found themselves caught in a trap of survival, unable to speak freely, unable to trust anyone, and forever haunted by the fear of death at the hands of the Revolutionary Tribunal. The Reign of Terror, which began in earnest in the summer of 1793, was a time of unprecedented violence, one that left an indelible mark on France. The guillotine, once thought to be a tool of swift and humane justice, became the icon of mass execution, marking the beginning of a gruesome period in which thousands of people lost their lives in the name of the revolution. In its wake, the Reign of Terror left behind a trail of blood that ran through the streets of Paris and across the entire country, touching even the most isolated villages, where fear, suspicion, and violence became a constant presence in daily life. The death toll from the terror is staggering. While estimates vary, historians agree that at least 16,000 people were executed by the guillotine, but the number of those who died as a result of mass shootings, torture, the executions were systematic and brutal, spanning not just the elite classes, those once entrenched in royal privilege, but also the common folk who had once embraced the revolution's ideals. The guillotine, which had been introduced as a more humane form of capital punishment, became a constant feature in the public square, a stark symbol of the revolution's descent into fear-driven violence. Every day, the terror's toll grew larger, as new victims were added to the execution lists of the Revolutionary Tribunal. In the first year of the terror, hundreds of victims were executed in the Place de la Concorde, including prominent figures of the aristocracy, such as Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. However, as Robespierre's influence grew and his paranoia deepened, the scope of executions expanded rapidly, stretching beyond the royal family and the aristocracy to include former allies, revolutionary leaders, and common citizens alike. The guillotine's blade was no longer reserved for the highborn or the ruling class. Anyone from the nobleman to the artisan to the revolutionary thinker could be swept up in the growing tide of violence. The Committee of Public Safety played a crucial role in ensuring that the terror spread far and wide. It was a bureaucratic machine of unprecedented efficiency, its sole function being to ensure that counter-revolutionary sentiment, whether real or imagined, was eradicated. Mass arrests became the norm, and individuals were quickly rounded up on suspicion alone. Once arrested, they were swiftly tried, often in a kangaroo court that allowed little time for defense, before being condemned to death. The rushed trials were a formality, a show of justice that concealed the true nature of the revolution's mission to stamp out any dissent. As the terror gained momentum, the numbers swelled. In 1794, at the peak of Robespierre's power, thousands were executed in just a few months. Some historians suggest that in this period, several hundred people were sent to the guillotine every week. The streets of Paris were filled with the echoes of the blade, and the once proud capital of the Enlightenment now stood as a city of death where the air was thick with fear and the sounds of screaming crowds rang out at each new execution. What began as a revolution of ideals now seemed to be a battle to the death over who could control the narrative of revolutionary virtue. While Paris became the epicenter of the reign of terror, with public executions taking place almost daily, the violence did not stay contained within the city. The revolution's reign of terror soon spread to the provinces, where entire villages were swept up in the violence. The Committee of Public Safety dispatched revolutionary agents throughout the country, enforcing the new regime's rules with deadly efficiency. In the West, the region became a flashpoint for revolutionary violence. Peasants in the, already suffering from the hardships of the revolution, rebelled against the new order when the revolutionary government sought to impose more taxes and religious reforms, including the civil constitution of the clergy, which sought to secularize the church. The revolt grew into a full-scale rebellion, and in response, the revolutionary forces crushed it with overwhelming brutality. Whole villages were burned to the ground, and thousands of people were killed in the military crackdown. The forces of the Republic, led by General Terreau, employed scorched earth tactics, burning crops, killing livestock, and executing anyone who resisted. Mass graves became common, and the guillotine was used in rural areas as well. Entire villages were destroyed, their residents either executed or forced into exile. The terror in the provinces was not confined to the. Across France, barricades were set up in rural towns, as peasants were forced to defend their homes against the advancing revolutionary army. The militia, once protectors of the villagers, now became enforcers of the state's will. Villagers lived in a state of constant fear, knowing that a single misstep, a single accusation, could lead to death at the hands of the revolutionary forces. The guillotine, once a tool used in the public squares of Paris, became a mobile death sentence for those who dared to resist. Whole communities were targeted by the forces of Robespierre's government, their identities erased, their resistance crushed beneath the weight of an all-powerful revolutionary state. In the south and north of France, similar acts of violence took place. The Revolutionary Tribunal expanded its reach to small towns where counter-revolutionary sentiment was perceived to be growing. In the towns of Lyon and Toulon, which had been sympathetic to the royalists, the revolutionary government retaliated with ruthless force, sending death squads to wipe out any potential enemies. Entire towns were put under siege, and the guillotine was used to maintain control, even in these remote rural settings. The sheer scale of the death toll during the Reign of Terror had a profound effect on French society. The violence and fear that permeated every corner of the nation created a psychological toll that reached beyond the dead. The violence became normalized, public executions became a regular part of life, and the guillotine lost its sense of horror in the eyes of the French public. What was once a method of swift justice became the hammer by which the revolution struck its enemies. Whether those enemies were the aristocracy, the peasants, or the revolutionaries themselves. In Paris, the once vibrant streets were transformed into places of death. The smell of decay hung in the air as bodies were carted away to mass graves. The public square, which had once been a symbol of liberty and freedom, was now a place where public executions were the norm. The guillotine's presence was ubiquitous. It stood as a reminder of the revolution's power, its capacity to punish anyone who stood in its way, and while the terror became institutionalized, its impact reached far beyond those who met their end beneath the blade. Everyone lived in fear, knowing that anyone could be next. A single accusation was all it took to be accused, tried, and sentenced to death. Even those who had once been supporters of the revolution now found themselves caught in a web of fear, unable to distinguish between friends and foes. The boundaries between loyalty and betrayal had blurred, as neighbors, family members, and longtime allies became suspects. The grief that followed each execution was not only felt by those who mourned the victims, but also by those who feared the inevitable next round of arrests. In towns across France, the rain of death left broken families, disrupted communities, and a nation torn apart by fear. The reign of terror did more than claim the lives of thousands. It slowly wore down the psyche of the people of France, grinding them into emotional exhaustion and psychological fatigue. The constant fear, the never-ending uncertainty, and the pervasive sense of danger created a collective trauma that left deep scars across the entire nation. Citizens from the most humble peasants to the noble class who had once held the reins of power found themselves crushed under the weight of a revolution gone astray, a revolution that was supposed to liberate them but instead entangled them in chains of a different sort. It was no longer just a matter of political oppression or economic hardship. It was the deep psychological toll of never knowing who to trust, of fearing that even the most innocuous words or innocent looks could be twisted into accusations of counter-revolutionary sentiment. For the peasants, the merchants, and even those within the ruling class, the emotional exhaustion was constant. People who had once felt the strength of community, the joy of revolutionary idealism, now found themselves in a world where friend and foe were indistinguishable. In every whispered conversation, in every hurried glance, in every moment of hesitation, the question was always, am I safe? Fear was the uninvited companion that followed everyone. Even the revolution's champions, those who had fought for freedom and equality, now found themselves victims of the terror they had helped create. Those who once championed the cause of liberty were now swept up in the same machine of repression that had begun with such lofty ideals. No one was immune. The guillotine, once a symbol of swift, almost clinical justice, had come to represent the crushing force of an uncontrollable system. It was no longer about punishing the guilty. It had become about eliminating anyone who could be seen as a threat, no matter how small or unfounded the threat seemed. The people of France were trapped in a reality where even survival became a political act. To live, to speak freely, to even exist in this world meant walking a tightrope of suspicion and fear. What had been a vibrant, hopeful time of change quickly became a dark, claustrophobic existence where hope seemed like a distant, fading memory. The emotional toll was felt most in the smallest moments, when a family sat down to eat, when neighbors gathered in quiet conversation, when workers returned home from the fields, tired and hungry. Every interaction now held the possibility of betrayal, the quiet terror that a single accusation could bring everything crashing down. As the reign of terror continued, people began to realize that the revolution they had fought for had become something unrecognizable. The hope for a better world, for a society based on liberty, equality, and fraternity, had withered under the iron fist of Robespierre and his Committee of Public Safety. For many peasants, who had once believed in the promise of the revolution, a promise that liberty and justice would finally be accessible to them, this hope quickly turned into a nightmare. They had envisioned a society where their struggles would be addressed, where the burdens of taxation, hunger, and exploitation would be alleviated. Instead, they found themselves trapped in a new form of oppression, where the old nobility was replaced by a new elite, one that wielded power through the revolutionary tribunal and the guillotine. The revolution promised a new beginning, but what it had delivered was a regime of terror. The peasants who had hoped to break free from their chains found that, instead of freedom, they had become enslaved to a new set of laws, a new set of ideals that were equally as oppressive, if not more so. The guillotine, which had initially been presented as a tool of justice, had now become a symbol of fear, a daily reminder that no one was safe. People were no longer terrified of the old aristocrats. They were terrified of their neighbors, their friends, and even their own thoughts. The fear of being accused, of being dragged into the revolutionary tribunal, was ever present. What had begun as a cry for liberty had transformed into a silencing of dissent. Robespierre's vision of virtue became the hammer of terror, and those who once believed in the revolution's promises now saw that they were nothing more than pawns in a game that consumed them. The emotional toll was unbearable. The fear of death overshadowed the hope of change, and soon, the guillotine became the final fate for anyone who dared to speak against the revolutionary government, even those who had fought for it in the beginning. The revolution of 1789 began with a fierce promise. Liberty, equality, and fraternity were meant to break the chains of the ancien and create a new world where the oppressed could finally be free. But as the reign of terror progressed, it became clear that these promises had been hollowed out. Liberty, once defined as the freedom to speak, to act, and to participate in society, was reduced to a mere illusion. Equality was not realized in the guillotine's shadow. Instead, it became a tool for uniformity, where anyone who dared to deviate from the revolution's path was marked for death. Fraternity, the idea that all citizens should stand together as one, became fractured as suspicion and betrayal replaced trust and mutual respect. For the peasants, the revolution's promise had been a dream of better days. They had seen the wealth and privilege of the aristocracy and longed for a world where they too could experience the benefits of a fair society. But as the reign of terror deepened, it became evident that the hierarchy of the old system had merely been replaced, not abolished. The peasants found themselves still carrying the weight of poverty, still struggling with harsh taxes, still facing hunger and disease. What had once seemed like the great equalizer, the revolution now felt like an endless cycle of suffering. The guillotine, which had once promised justice, now became a tool of subjugation, ironic and terrifying in its twisted reflection of the old order. The new government, led by Robespierre, had promised to lead the people toward a new society, but instead, it had led them into a pit of fear and death. The terror was the natural result of a revolutionary government that had once been inspired by noble ideals, but was now driven by fear and the need for control. The leaders of the revolution, who had once been the heroes of liberty and equality, became executioners, enforcing a system of absolute conformity where no one, not even the most loyal, was safe from the wrath of the state. The revolution's promises had been distorted and corrupted beyond recognition. In the villages, peasants, once hopeful for a better future, now lived in a constant state of fear, trapped in a world that offered no hope of liberation, no promise of freedom. The revolution, which had begun with the hope of justice, had instead become a mechanism of oppression. The noble ideals of liberty and equality had been replaced with terror and bloodshed, and the peasants who had once believed in the promise of a new world found themselves caught in a cycle of violence that seemed endless. The psychological toll was not just felt in the immediate aftermath of executions, but in the slow erosion of the spirit. The revolution's promises had shattered, and the peasants were left with nothing but the harsh reality of living in a world where survival meant compromise, betrayal, and often death. The dream of a better world had slipped away, replaced with the reality of constant surveillance, injustice, and fear. The guillotine, once a tool of justice, had become the final judge, deciding who would live and who would die in the name of a revolution gone astray. As the last echoes of the guillotine's blade fell silent across the streets of Paris, the terror that had gripped France for so long seemed to lose its ferocity. The reign of terror, which had led to the execution of thousands from nobles to peasants, from revolutionaries to the innocent, was drawing to a close. Yet, while the blood had stopped flowing and the guillotine's blade had ceased to strike, the memory of its terror remained, as lasting and indelible as the stones of the city itself. In the wake of Robespierre's fall from power, as the revolution shifted in new directions, the fear that had dominated the lives of every French citizen was never truly erased. The echoes of that fear still reverberated through the streets, through the minds, and through the bones of a nation that had seen itself ripped apart by violence. In the city of Paris, where one's grand ideals of liberty had been twisted into a nightmare of violence, the aftermath of the reign of terror was far from clean. The streets, once filled with the fervent cries of freedom and equality, now carried a different sound, a whispering ghost of a time when the guillotine had been the tool of both justice and fear. The public executions may have ceased, but the spirit of terror lingered in the collective consciousness of a city and a country, forever marked by the horrors that it had endured. The blood spilled in those final days did not simply seep into the pavement, it permeated the very soul of France, leaving behind not just a trail of bodies, but a legacy of distrust, paranoia, and psychological exhaustion. As the terror ebbed away, the guillotine's shadow continued to shape the future of France. The fear of betrayal, once so pervasive that it governed every moment of daily life, was replaced with a new form of uncertainty. The streets of Paris, still haunted by the memory of those who had fallen beneath the blade, now seemed almost empty, not in the literal sense, but in a deeper, more unsettling way. There was a silence, a deadening stillness, that no words could fill. Paris, a city that had once shouted for freedom, now seemed to carry its shame, and its soul had become weary. People walked more cautiously, looked over their shoulders more often, and, perhaps, no one trusted anyone anymore. The city that had once been so full of revolutionary fervor was now filled with the ghostly weight of those who had fallen both in body and spirit. But the terror did not end with Robespierre's downfall or the collapse of the Committee of Public Safety. Instead, it lingered in the dark, in the shadows of a nation still reeling from the horrors it had lived through. The catacombs of Paris, those vast underground burial sites, would serve as silent witnesses to the unhealed wounds of the revolution. Beneath the city's surface, amid the bones of the dead, lay the memory of a time when liberty was the rallying cry for freedom. But in practice, liberty had been warped, distorted, and hollowed out by the terror that followed in its wake. Thousands of bodies, victims of the guillotine, were buried in those catacombs, their lives snuffed out by the very forces that had once promised them freedom. The bones, scattered and stacked, silently tell the story of a city that had lost its way. They speak of the betrayals, of the lives wasted by unfounded suspicion, and of the invisible scars left on those who lived through it. Each bone, each empty eye socket, tells the story of a life cut short. A life that may have once held hope but was crushed under the weight of fear and violence. The memory of the guillotine would live on not just in the minds of the survivors, but in the very earth beneath their feet. As the revolution moved on, with new leaders and shifting ideals, the fear that had pervaded French society gradually diminished, but it was never fully erased. In the years to come, the legacy of the terror would haunt French politics, casting a long shadow over the revolutionary ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity. The violence of the past could not be easily erased. The people of France, while trying to rebuild their nation, carried with them a deep scar that no revolution could truly heal. The catacombs, filled with bones and memories, stood as a symbol of the revolutionary idealism turned to brutality, and of the fractured trust that continued to shape the country for generations. Even as the reign of terror concluded, the French public was left to grapple with the aftermath of such a profound tragedy. The revolution had promised a new world, a new order founded on the principles of equality and freedom, but, in the end, it delivered only bloodshed and fear. The new world created by the revolution had become one in which betrayal and survival trumped liberty and justice. In the end, those who had fought so fiercely for freedom found themselves trapped in a world where their voices were silenced by fear, and their trust shattered by a revolutionary machine that devoured its own children. The revolution had indeed changed France, but not in the way many had hoped. As the dust settled and the guillotine's shadow faded from the public square, the people of France began to realize that the true cost of liberty had been not only physical lives, but the spirit of the nation. The terror had stripped them of more than their lives, it had stripped them of faith in the very ideals they had once fought for. The city of Paris, vibrant and alive with movement, is often described as a place of energy, history, and ceaseless activity. Above ground, the bustling streets hum with the sound of horse-drawn carriages, the chattering of merchants in crowded marketplaces, and the laughter of Parisians strolling along the Seine. The air is filled with the mingling sense of fresh-baked bread, perfume, and the rich aroma of roasted chestnut scenes, of a city living at the pulse of life. But beneath this urban chaos, far from the busy boulevards and public squares, a different world exists. It is a world that has been forgotten by time, where the past lingers in silence and the memories of the dead rest in quiet obscurity. As we descend beneath the streets of Paris, away from the sunlight that touches the great monuments and palaces above, we enter a realm where the echoes of the past are not shouted from grand podiums, but instead whispered in the cold, damp air of the earth itself. In the Paris catacombs, the bustling energy of the city fades away, replaced by an eerie stillness that surrounds you with a weight of heavy silence. Each step you take further into the catacombs pulls you deeper into this quiet, ancient world, a world buried beneath the weight of centuries. You feel the contrast in the air immediately. The freshness of the world above is replaced by a chill that seeps into your bones, a constant reminder that this is not a place for the living but for the dead. The passageways of the catacombs seem endless, winding and narrow, as if leading you farther and farther away from the vibrancy of life. The weight of history seems to press down upon you here, as though the very stones that line these walls are steeped in the memories of all those who passed through the gates of this underground labyrinth. As you step into the darkness of the catacombs, the air around you grows cool and damp, carrying with it the faint mustiness of earth and stone. The smell is stale, heavy with the scent of decaying wood and moist limestone. It's not an unpleasant odor, but it has a certain earthy quality, a reminder that you are deep beneath the city, where the living seldom venture. The silence that envelops you is profound. At first it feels like just the absence of sound, but as you descend further into the depths, the silence becomes tangibly weight in the air. The echo of your footsteps reverberates through the long, winding corridors, but there is little else. No chatter of voices, no hum of life, only the distant drip of water somewhere in the dark. Each footstep you take seems to be swallowed by the thick silence, as though the walls themselves are absorbing your every movement. The further you walk, the air grows thicker, the darkness deeper. Dim lighting from a few sparse, flickering lanterns casts long, shifting shadows across the stone floor. You might catch glimpses of the walls lined with the bones of the dead, but in the heart, it's hard to discern whether these are just shadows or the remains of the countless individuals who were once alive. There's something unnerving about the silence in the catacombs. It isn't simply the absence of noise, it's the presence of something, a quiet heaviness that seems to fill the space, as though the dead themselves are not entirely at rest. There is no wind here to rustle the air, no sounds of the earth shifting. The only sound that accompanies you is the soft echo of your footsteps, a rhythmic sound that feels oddly reassuring in such a place. The walls around you grow tighter as you move deeper into the catacombs, and soon you see what you came for: the bones. They appear slowly at first, stacked in neat rows, a collection of forgotten remains that have been left to rest in the shadow of history. The bones are not just thrown together in disarray but arranged with a sense of order, stacked in an almost methodical fashion. Skulls, femurs, ribs, and clavicles all are carefully placed to create long, winding walls of human remains. The sheer scale of the display is both humbling and eerie, as though the bones themselves are reaching back through time, reminding you of the lives lived, the lives lost. As you move further, you notice that some of the skulls are faced outward, their empty eye sockets staring into the dark corridors, while others lie in the dark recesses of the tunnels, hidden from view. The bones form patterns, delicate arrangements that speak to the care taken in creating this underground cemetery. It's almost as if the catacombs were once meant to be a place of respectful memorial, not merely a mass grave. The bones create an almost artistic display, though it is an art born of necessity and survival. They are not the bodies of the privileged or the rich. They are the bodies of the forgotten, the ordinary people whose names were lost to history. In the catacombs, all are equal, reduced to bones. The tunnels grow darker, and as you peer deeper into the chambers, you notice the sheer number of skulls, stacked neatly on shelves carved into the stone. The skulls are arranged in patterns, creating shapes that suggest an almost ritualistic quality to their placement. In some areas, the bones seem to form intricate archways, guiding you through the labyrinth of the dead. The sight of these bones is both fascinating and unsettling, a testament to the lives that have been lost and the lives that now remain forgotten. You feel a strange tension between the visual chaos of bones and the immense calm of the space. It is as though the bones themselves, despite their number, have found peace in the underground world. They rest in silence, far from the world of the living, where the noise of revolution, fear, and terror once echoed through the streets above. As you move forward, you begin to sense the history in these walls. The bones are not just markers of death, they are the silent witnesses of a time when liberty, equality, and fraternity were nothing more than abstract ideals, as fragile as the bones that lie beneath your feet. The silent presence of these remains serves as a memento mori, a reminder that life is fleeting, and the grand narratives of history are often written in the bodies of the forgotten. In this underground world, time seems to have stood still. The walls of the catacombs are like pages of a book, etched with the stories of a revolution gone astray. These bones are the final testament to the sacrifices made, not just in the name of the revolution, but also in the name of hope, betrayal, and the price of political change. In the silent, oppressive dark, the bones remain immovable, unyielding, and eternal. As you stand at the threshold of this somber, chilling place, the weight of the revolution's paradox becomes clear. The ideals that had once inspired a nation to rise up against its rulers had ultimately led to a reign of terror, where the guillotine's blade spared no one, neither the powerful nor the powerless, neither the privileged nor the oppressed. The catacombs stand as a silent testament to the tragic consequences of a revolution that turned its ideals into a machine of death, and to a city whose streets are still haunted by the bones of those who perished in its wake. As we leave the quiet darkness of the catacombs, we begin to understand the complexity of the revolution's legacy, a legacy that still influences not just the streets of Paris, but the very soul of France. The Paris catacombs, one of the most famous underground burial sites in the world, have an origin that is not at all linked to death and burial, but rather to mining and construction. Long before the reign of terror and the bloodshed that would fill its chambers with victims, the catacombs were born from the practical need for limestone to build the growing city of Paris. Paris, being a city of continual development throughout the medieval and early modern periods, required vast quantities of building materials. The limestone that lay beneath the city's surface was perfect for construction, especially for the grand buildings and monuments that were rising throughout Paris. By the late 1700s, a vast network of quarries had been dug beneath the city. These quarries, particularly in the areas surrounding the Montparnasse and Denfert-Trochereau districts, had already been used for centuries to provide the necessary stone for constructing buildings like the Notre Dame Cathedral, the Louvre, and even the city's walls. These tunnels, however, were often unstable, and over time, the foundations of Paris began to suffer. Many of the underground caverns began to collapse or show signs of erosion, threatening the buildings above and prompting the authorities to seek a way to stabilize the city's underground. In 1777, the inspection of the quarries led to the decision to turn some of them into a burial site for the ever-growing number of bodies piling up in the overcrowded cemeteries of Paris. Paris, in the late 18th century, was struggling with a graveyard crisis. The cemeteries, once plentiful in space, were now overflowing. Particularly infamous was the Des Innocents, located in the heart of Paris. For centuries it had been the primary burial site for ordinary Parisians, especially the poor. By the 1780s, however, the cemetery had become a health hazard, with bodies often exposed to the elements, and the smell of decay permeating the area. Disease outbreaks, particularly plague and cholera, were rampant, likely due to the close proximity of so many corpses to the living. The decision was made in 1786 to remove the remains from the Des Innocents and relocate them to the catacombs. This was no small task, as it involved not just the relocation of thousands, but eventually millions of bodies. The remains were carefully excavated from the old cemetery and transported to the catacombs, in what became an immense and complex operation. Entire teams of workers were employed to move the bodies, and the process took several years. As the bones were brought into the tunnels, they were neatly stacked in rows, often organized in intricate patterns, though initially, this was likely done out of necessity more than a sense of ritualistic honor. Over time, however, the bones began to be arranged in artistic displays, the neat stacks becoming the symbolic arrangement that we recognize today. The sheer scale of the operation was astounding. The catacombs stretched for miles beneath the city, with a network of tunnels spanning over 200 miles. As bodies from Des Innocents and later other burial grounds were moved to the catacombs, the space gradually became a vast underground ossuary. The bones, once crammed together in crowded cemeteries, now had room to rest in relative peace beneath the streets of Paris, though the sense of stillness was tinged with the practicality that had first led to their relocation. Thus, the Paris catacombs began their existence as a solution to a civic problem, a place where the dead could be laid to rest with more care and safety than their former resting places. Yet, this practicality would soon take on a much darker significance. As the French Revolution began to shape the course of French history, the catacombs, originally intended to solve the overcrowding of Parisian cemeteries, soon took on a far darker role with the advent of the Revolution. In 1793, as the Revolution began to unravel into chaos, the streets of Paris became a theater of violence. The guillotine, introduced as a method of swift justice, became the symbol of the new regime's brutal measures against those seen as counter-revolutionaries. The reign of terror under the leadership of Robespierre and the Committee of Public Safety became a period defined by mass executions, not just of royals but of revolutionaries, nobles, and ordinary citizens who were suspected of disloyalty to the cause. In this context, the Paris catacombs, once a pragmatic solution to an overcrowded cemetery, became the final resting place for many of the victims of the guillotine. The bloodshed in the streets above was now mirrored in the darkness beneath the city, where the bodies of the executed were dumped without ceremony. The guillotine's blade, once seen as a tool of swift justice, had become the tool of terror, a weapon of fear that brought down even the most loyal revolutionaries. These bodies were not given the honor of a name or a headstone. Instead, they were tossed into the catacombs like those who had died long before them, anonymous, forgotten, and lost to history. The irony of the catacombs' role in this period is palpable. The catacombs were now a place where the very ideals of the revolution, equality, liberty, and fraternity, were subverted by the reign of terror. The bodies of the victims were not buried with any distinction. They were simply added to the existing piles of bones, often stacked haphazardly. with little more than a passing thought to their former lives or the ideals they had fought for. These bones, once individuals with hopes and dreams, had now been reduced to nothing more than part of the dark backdrop of the revolution's story, reminder of how quickly the dream of liberty could be corrupted by violence and paranoia. The catacombs thus became a silent witness to the revolution's tragic turn. What was once an underground space meant for the quiet burial of the dead became a memorial to the forgotten, to those who had fought for freedom but had met their ends in guillotines across the city. There was no ceremony for these fallen revolutionaries, no memorial in the catacombs to mark their contribution to the cause. They were simply tossed into the dark, their bones added to the pile. Another set of silent remains in a place that now spoke only of violence, betrayal, and lost ideals. As the terror escalated, the catacombs became a burial ground not just for victims of the guillotine, but for the soul of the revolution itself. These bones stopped being just anonymous remnants of a bygone era. They now became part of a national memory that spoke to the moral cost of revolution, the sacrifice of idealism in the name of control. The very bones that lay in the catacombs echoed the revolution's contradictions, its promise of liberty and equality, destroyed by terror. The Paris catacombs, which began as a solution to an overcrowded cemetery, evolved into an eerie symbol of the reign of terror and the tragic loss of the revolution's founding ideals. The bones that lie in the catacombs are not just remains of the dead. They are the silent witnesses to a time when liberty became intertwined with fear and equality gave way to violence. The catacombs hold within their stone walls not only the remains of those who died, but also the memories of those who once believed that a better, more just world was possible, a belief that was ultimately lost in the shadows of the guillotine's blade. Through the tunnels and walls of the catacombs, we hear the silent echoes of a revolutionary dream that never fully came to fruition. The catacombs, filled with bones, serve as a stark reminder of the unintended consequences of revolutionary fervor, of how the very desire to create a new society can consume itself in the process. The bones of the guillotine's victims are a testament to the tragic irony of the revolutionary movement that aimed for freedom but delivered terror, and that, in the end, left the skeletons of the past to bear witness to its ultimate failure. As we continue this journey into the depths of Paris history, we begin to understand the legacy of the terror, not just in the blood spilled on the streets, but in the bones that lie beneath. The catacombs hold more than the remains of the dead. They hold the silent story of a revolution gone astray, a story written in bone and dust, forgotten in the dark silence of history. The bones that line the walls of the Paris catacombs are more than mere remains. They are not simply the scattered fragments of a forgotten people. They are silent witnesses, bearing witness to the paradoxes of the French Revolution, in a city that once roared with cries of liberty, equality, and fraternity. These bones offer a chilling contrast between the noble ideals of the revolution and the bloody reality of its terror. Each bone, whether it belongs to a noble, a revolutionary, or a common laborer, speaks of the violence that swept through the streets of Paris, erasing the very ideals it was meant to uphold. These bones are reminders of how the pursuit of freedom can become tainted when it is driven by fear and suspicion, when the lines between justice and violence become blurred. In the early days of the revolution, the streets rang with promises of freedom and equality. People fought for the right to be heard, for the right to live free from oppression, and for the idea of a new world where power would no longer be concentrated in the hands of a monarchy or aristocracy. Yet, over time, the revolution's lofty ideals morphed into something unrecognizable. The very principles of liberty and equality that had inspired the masses were used as justification for the extermination of enemies, both real and perceived. These bones, lying silently in the catacombs, are metaphors for the revolution's failure, the failure to maintain the balance between justice and retribution, between freedom and control. In the quest for liberty, the revolution fell into the same traps it had hoped to escape. The guillotine, initially seen as a tool of justice, became a weapon of fear, a reminder that no one was safe in a world where the lines between right and wrong were constantly shifting. These bones are the silent testimony to that shift, to the irony of a movement that began with hope and ended with terror. As you walk through the catacombs, each step brings you closer to this chilling realization. The bones stare out from their neat rows, their empty eye sockets fixed in a silent gaze that speaks of the lives they once led. These are not just anonymous remains, they are the witnesses to a story of idealism gone wrong, a story of how freedom can be crushed under the weight of its own violence. The catacombs, filled with the bones of the fallen, serve as the final chapter in the story of the revolution's contradictions, graveyard of the ideals it once promised to uphold. Beneath the stone walls of the catacombs, the bones of the revolution's victims lie in quiet repose, but in the stillness, there is a tragic anonymity. Once, these individuals were flesh and blood, with stories, families, and dreams of a better future. They were revolutionaries who believed in the promise of a new world, aristocrats who fought to preserve the old order, and ordinary citizens caught in the storm of a revolutionary tide. They could neither control nor escape. But now, in the catacombs, their identities are lost, erased by time and by the relentless machinery of the revolution that crushed them underfoot. In the catacombs, the bones are arranged in neat, orderly stacked skulls, ribs, limbs, each individual reduced to an object, a memory, a fragment of the world that once was. They are no longer people, they are just remains. The catacombs serve as a monument to their erasure, not just their bodies, but their stories. There are no names here, no markers, no plaques to honor these lives lost to the guillotine. These bones speak not of individuality, but of collective annihilation. For many, the deaths that filled the catacombs were anonymous, as the faces behind the bodies were hidden from the public eye. In the frenzy of the Reign of Terror, thousands of lives were snuffed out, their identities forgotten in the wake of political expediency. The revolutionary tribunal that carried out these executions was more concerned with the maintenance of power than with the recognition of individual lives. The justice that was promised, the equality that was supposed to define the revolution, was subverted by the tide of fear that swept through the streets of Paris. In the end, the guillotine became a tool of blind vengeance, where names were forgotten, and the individuals whose lives were cut short were lost in the shadows of history. This erasure is the most profound tragedy of the catacombs. While the revolution claimed to be a movement for freedom and justice, the silent graves of the catacombs remind us of the cost of those ideals, the price paid by those who dared to speak, to act, or to simply exist, in a world where loyalty and disloyalty were constantly redefined. The bones in the catacombs are not just anonymous victims. They are the forgotten, those whose names were swallowed by the machine of terror, whose lives were dismissed in the rush to eliminate all that was seen as a threat to the revolutionary order. In the catacombs, there is an overwhelming sense of silence, not just the absence of sound, but the weight of absence itself. It's a silence that fills the tunnels, that echoes in the narrow passages, and that hangs heavy in the still air. The bones that fill these underground galleries are not just the remnants of the dead. They are the very embodiment of the silence left behind by a revolution gone wrong. The catacombs are not merely a burial site. They are a monument to the lost voices of those who were silenced in the name of freedom. Each bone in the catacombs speaks of a life that was once lived, but that life has been obliterated by time and by the blunt force of history. The skulls that peer out from the walls may have once held the hopes and dreams of the people of France, but now their empty eye sockets are all that remain. Their voices, once full of passion and promise, are now silenced, and their stories have faded into the forgotten annals of history. The silence of the catacombs serves as a stark reminder of the cost of revolution. It is a symbol of the gap between the ideals of the revolution and the violence that ultimately consumed it. The bones, once the foundation of human lives, now lie as empty symbols of a time when the ideal of liberty was corrupted by the reality of terror. The catacombs stand as a testament to the fact that, in the end, no one was truly safe in a world where fear and paranoia ruled. The bones speak quietly of the paradox at the heart of the revolution, the dream of freedom suffocated by the terror it unleashed. There is irony in the bones of the catacombs. Their very presence calls into question the purpose of the revolution. What began as a movement for freedom, equality, and brotherhood was ultimately consumed by its own contradictions. The guillotine, which was supposed to bring justice, became a symbol of fear and violence, cutting down not only the enemies of the state, but also those who had once fought for the same ideals. In the end, the guillotine and the bones it left behind became the ultimate symbol of the revolution's betrayal of its own purpose. The bones in the catacombs remind us that, while the revolution sought to break free from tyranny, it ultimately fell into its own trap. The liberty it promised was replaced by terror, and the equality it espoused was swallowed by the blind rage that led to the execution of anyone deemed a threat. The silence of the bones is the silence of idealism destroyed by the very force that claimed to protect it. In the end, the catacombs stand as the final witness to the tragic irony of the revolution, a movement that sought to give life, but which ultimately left only death in its wake. These bones, once part of the vibrant life of Paris, now lie in the catacombs as silent witnesses to the lost dreams of the revolution. The catacombs are not just a resting place for the dead. They are a symbol of the revolution's ultimate failure, the failure to uphold the very ideals it claimed to protect. These bones, silent in their final resting places, speak to us of a time when justice, equality, and freedom were ideals that had no place in a society consumed by violence and fear. As you stand before the silent bones in the Paris catacombs, you are confronted not just with the remains of the dead, but with the irony of a system that devoured its own children. Many of the bones that lie here belonged to those who were once at the very forefront of the revolution, the passionate individuals who had once fought tirelessly for the liberty and equality that the revolution promised. Yet, when the reign of terror turned on its own, these once celebrated figures of freedom found themselves condemned to the guillotine, the very instrument that had symbolized the revolution's call for justice. Among the first to fall victim to the terror were men like Georges Danton and Camille Desmoulins, two of the most fervent advocates for liberty at the beginning of the revolution. Danton, with his fiery speeches and tireless efforts to rally the masses, had been a hero of the storming of the Bastille, a symbol of the revolutionary spirit. Desmoulins, a journalist and close friend of Danton, had been equally committed to the cause, advocating for the rights of the common people and the end of monarchical rule. Together, they were among the leaders of the Jacobins, the faction that had led the revolution into its most radical phases. Yet, as the reign of terror escalated and the revolution began to devour its own, these men were accused of being enemies of the state. The political paranoia that gripped the government, particularly under the leadership of Robespierre, led to a violent purge of even the most prominent revolutionaries. Danton and Desmoulins, who had once been celebrated as champions of freedom, were now labeled as counter-revolutionaries. The same guillotine that had been used to rid France of its monarch and aristocracy was turned on them. Their executions, alongside others like Lazare Carnot and Philippot, marked the tragic irony of the revolution. These were men who had once envisioned a world of freedom and equality, but who had become the first victims of the very system they helped create. The catacombs, where their bodies now lie, serve as a grim reminder of the cost of political betrayal. It's an irony that still echoes in the walls of the catacombs. Those who had once championed liberty were cut down by the very ideals they had fought for. Their bones now rest among the remains of those who were likewise silenced, their contributions to the revolution reduced to whispers in the dark. As you walk among the bones of these revolutionaries, there's a palpable sense of betrayal. These were men whose ideas, whose voices, had once stirred the masses to action, and yet, in the end, they were consigned to death by the same forces they had helped unleash. The revolution, intended to deliver freedom, ended up becoming a mechanism of destruction, consuming its heroes as easily as its enemies. But the bones in the catacombs are not only those of revolutionaries, they are also the remains of aristocrats and royalists, victims of the egalitarian violence that defined the terror. The guillotine, once meant to be a symbol of justice, came to embody the blindness of the revolution, where class, nobility, and rank mattered little in the face of suspicion and the lust for power. The revolution had promised equality for all, yet in the end, it delivered only death for all regardless of one's social status. The aristocracy, long the target of revolutionary wrath, was among the first to feel the sharp bite of the guillotine. Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, symbols of the old order, were executed in 1793, marking the beginning of a mass execution campaign aimed at dismantling the monarchy and aristocracy. Their bodies, alongside countless others, were thrown into the streets and discarded like those of common criminals. Yet, as the terror wore on, the revolutionaries found that no one was safe, not even those who had fought for the revolution itself. It is here in the catacombs, where the bodies of both the aristocracy and ordinary people lie together, that the symbolism of the revolution's egalitarianism becomes starkly apparent. The guillotine saw no rank. It cared little for class or station. Whether you were a king or a peasant, your fate was determined not by your wealth or status, but by your perceived loyalty to the cause. This democratic violence, where the rich and the poor met the same fate, becomes an unsettling symbol of the revolution's deeper contradictions. The nobles, long protected by the power of the monarchy, were cast down alongside the common people, not as individuals, but as faceless victims of a system that demanded total allegiance. In the catacombs, the noble skulls rest next to those of the peasantry and the working class, serving as an eerie testament to the uniformity of death in the revolution. The guillotine's blade cut across all divisions, offering a vision of democracy in death, but one that came at the cost of personal identity. The anonymity of the bodies in the catacombs highlights the tragic futility of revolutionary ideals turned to terror. In the end, The revolution, which had promised to destroy the old system of privilege, created a new one based on the uncertainty of fear. The bones of the noble and the commoner lie side by side in the catacombs, reminding us that in the final reckoning, the revolution did not deliver equality, but simply replaced one form of oppression with another. While the bones of the aristocracy and the revolutionaries dominate the narrative of the revolution's bloodshed, the catacombs also hold the forgotten remains of women, many of whom were active in the revolution, while others were victims of its shifting loyalties. Among the most poignant of these figures is Olympe de Gouges, the playwright and activist who famously wrote the Declaration of the Rights of Woman and the Female Citizen in 1791. Olympe, a passionate advocate for women's rights, had fought for equality in the revolution but was ultimately executed by the Revolutionary Tribunal in 1793, condemned as an enemy of the state for her criticisms of the Reign of Terror. Her death, like those of many women during the revolution, was part of a gendered violence that characterized the period. While the guillotine claimed both men and women equally, the fate of women in the revolution was often more complicated. Women who had participated in the revolution, even those who had fought for its ideals, were sometimes seen as political threats or symbols of the old order. Their participation in political discourse and rebellion was viewed as dangerous. And as the revolution began to turn inward, women were often silenced both figuratively and literally. The bones of these women, whose bodies lie unmarked in the catacombs, represent the forgotten voices of the revolution. They were active participants, like Charlotte Corday, who assassinated Jean-Paul Marat, or Marie Antoinette, the last queen of France, who was executed alongside her husband. Their bones rest alongside the male revolutionaries, but their stories are often left untold. These women, whether patriots or victims of shifting allegiances, stand as a reminder that the revolutionary dream was often a dream of exclusion, where even the most vocal advocates for equality could be lost in the machinery of terror. In the catacombs, these unsung heroes remain silenced, their sacrifices overshadowed by the more well-known names of their male counterparts. The bones of women like Olympe de Gouges, whose calls for women's rights were erased by the very revolution she had supported, are a tragic reminder of how gendered violence continued to permeate society. Their final resting places, unmarked and anonymous, are a symbol of how the revolution's ideals of equality could be lost in the face of terror, how women's voices, despite their power and passion, were often silenced in a world that did not see them as equal players in the story of the revolution. As the bones of the revolution's victims rest in the catacombs, they speak not just of the suffering and violence of the time, but of the lost identities of those who fought for a better world. Whether they were revolutionaries, aristocrats, or women, these victims serve as a silent testament to the cost of revolution and the ways in which political violence can erase not just lives, but memories. The catacombs are more than just a burial place for the dead. They are a graveyard of ideals where the bones of those who dared to imagine a better world lie in quiet defiance, reminding us of the fragility of revolution and the inevitability of its contradictions. The Paris catacombs are not merely a burial place, they are the echoes of the revolution's psychological toll, a testament to the collective trauma felt by the people of Paris and beyond during the Reign of Terror. As you stand in the stillness of these tunnels, surrounded by the bones of the dead, you can almost feel the weight of fear that once gripped the hearts of every individual in France. These silent chambers, dark and foreboding, are a reflection of the mental anguish that reverberated throughout the streets of Paris. During the years when the guillotine became the ultimate symbol of justice and terror, the revolution, which began with lofty ideals of freedom, equality, and fraternity, quickly descended into a nightmarish cycle of paranoia and death. The blade of the guillotine fell with brutal efficiency, cutting down those who were seen as enemies of the state, often with little more than a whispered accusation. The sight of the guillotine, its blade shining in the light of a cruel sun, became synonymous with fear, as it promised swift justice, but only for those unlucky enough to be caught in its deadly path. To the people of Paris, the guillotine became more than just an instrument of death, it was a constant presence, a reminder that no one, no matter how loyal to the revolution, was safe from its wrath. The paranoia of the era was palpable. In every shadowed corner of the city, whispers of betrayal were exchanged, as neighbors feared being reported by their own. The Revolutionary Tribunal lurked as an ever-present specter, watching for signs of counter-revolutionary sentiment. The fear of arrest permeated daily life, with individuals unsure of whom they could trust and whether their actions or words would be twisted to fit the revolutionary narrative. The revolution, once a movement of the people, had become an unseen force of oppression. Vigilantism, fueled by fear, spread throughout the country as people turned on one another, betraying their own families, friends, and neighbors in hopes of escaping the reign of terror. Even as the guillotine's blade fell less frequently, the psychological scars left on the populace were deep and enduring. People who had once participated in the revolutionary cause were now haunted by guilt or by the memory of those they had betrayed. The constant fear of arrest and the threat of execution had woven a web of anxiety around every corner of French society. Families were torn apart by the fear of what might happen to their loved ones, and the paranoia that gripped the nation left emotional scars that would never fully heal. The catacombs, silent and still, became a graveyard for more than just the physical remains of those who died. They were the final resting place for a nation's spirit, consumed by the ever-present shadow of betrayal, fear, and violence. It is in these bones, quietly stacked and forgotten, that the psychological toll of the revolution is most deeply felt. The revolution promised to bring about a new world, one of justice and equality, but instead, it brought division, violence, and an all-consuming sense of terror that left its mark on every individual. The catacombs as they sit today offer a solemn reminder of how quickly a movement born from idealism can turn into a cycle of suffering, how hope and promise can so easily devolve into paranoia, betrayal, and a nation's undoing. When the revolution began in 1789, it was full of promise. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen proclaimed ideals of freedom, equality, and fraternity. And the people of France rallied behind the vision of a new world free from the oppression of the monarchy and the nobility. The revolution was seen as a moment of liberation, an opportunity to build a society where every citizen had a voice, where the old hierarchies of power and privilege were destroyed, and where justice would prevail. Yet, as the revolution progressed, something insidious began to unfold, a corruption of the very ideals it had been founded upon. The vision of liberty became entwined with the desire for control. The righteous pursuit of equality was overshadowed by the need for uniformity. The brotherhood of the revolution was fractured by fear and violence. What had started as a movement of hope quickly devolved into a nightmarish system of terror, where the guillotine became the tool used to enforce the revolution's will. The catacombs, which began as a pragmatic solution to the city's overcrowded cemeteries, became the final resting place for many who had once been at the forefront of the revolutionary movement. These were the bodies of individuals who had fought for the ideals of liberty only to be swept up in the very system they had sought to create. The guillotine, which was originally intended to be a symbol of justice and reform, became a mechanism of fear, where the lines between justice and retribution were hopelessly blurred. The revolution promised freedom but delivered a new form of oppression, one that was just as ruthless, just as violent, as the system it had replaced. The bones in the catacombs stand as a silent testament to the tragic irony of the revolution. Liberty was sacrificed on the altar of control, equality was replaced by conformity, and fraternity was shattered by the fear of betrayal. What began as a dream of a better world soon became a nightmare, where the very people who had fought for freedom found themselves silenced by the revolution's violence. The guillotine, once a symbol of change, had turned into an instrument of tyranny where no one was safe from the shadow of suspicion and the weight of paranoia. The catacombs, with their silent rows of bones, encapsulate this tragic turn in the revolution's story. The bones of the victims, whether they were the aristocrats, the revolutionaries, or the ordinary citizens, all share the same silence. They serve as a reminder of how quickly revolutionary idealism can be transformed into a system of oppression. When the lines between justice and violence are blurred, the bones of those who died in the reign of terror are not just a reflection of the violence of the time, but of the collapse of the ideals the revolution had once promised to uphold. The revolution's original ideals, liberty, equality, and fraternity, became the very things that were lost during the terror. The dream of a new society, free from the tyranny of the past, was replaced by the tyranny of fear. The catacombs, silent and unyielding, stand as the final resting place for those who believed in the promise of the revolution, only to have their lives snuffed out by the very system they had fought to create. In the catacombs, the bones of the revolution's victims lie in quiet repose, but the shadow of the guillotine looms large over them. The guillotine, which had once been a symbol of hope, became the instrument of terror that tore through the revolution's heart. Each bone in the catacombs serves as a reminder of how quickly the ideals of the revolution were twisted, how the desire for justice gave way to a system of oppression, and how the promise of liberty was crushed under the weight of paranoia and fear. These bones are not merely the remains of the dead. They are the silent witnesses to a revolution that, despite its noble origins, ended in a tragic cycle of violence. The revolution's spirit-tight promise of freedom and equality was lost in the machinery of terror, and in the quiet depths of the Paris catacombs, where the bones of the dead lie together, the past echoes an eternal reminder of how quickly the light of liberty can be extinguished by the shadow of fear. As you move through the catacombs, the silence is deafening. But in that silence, there is a lesson that history will always teach us. The bones of the revolution's victims are not just the remnants of the past. They are a warning to all those who believe in the power of ideals. No revolution is free from the danger of violence, and even the brightest dreams can be drowned in terror. As we emerge from the oppressive darkness of the Paris catacombs, where the bones of the dead lie in silent testimony to the cost of revolution, we find ourselves transported from one world of decay and forgotten ideals to another. Above ground, far from the quiet, eerie tunnels, another form of decay was festering in the Palace of Versailles, where the old regime continued to live in excess, luxury, and denial. In the catacombs we saw the physical remnants of those who had fallen victim to the revolution as violence. Those who had become pawns in a game of power, their ideals twisted and consumed by the terror that defined their time. The catacombs were the burial ground for the nation's spirit, a place where the bones of the dead served as a grim reminder of the failed promises of the revolution. But above ground, in the glittering halls of Versailles, the decay was of a different kind, decay of luxury, where the old regime clung to its privileges, blind to the unrest that was slowly encroaching upon them. While the guillotine had been cutting down the opponents of the revolution, the palace at Versailles remained an island of opulence, untouched by the storm of revolution that brewed just outside its walls. Here, the royal court carried on with its extravagant parties, feasts, and ceremonies, completely oblivious to the hunger, fear, and anger of the people they ruled over. The last vestiges of the old-world monarchy, privilege, and oppression continued to live on in Versailles, even as the revolution began to tear the country apart. The contrast between the silent bones of the catacombs and the opulent world of Versailles could not be more striking. One place, deep beneath the streets of Paris, symbolized the suffering, betrayal, and violence that had engulfed the nation. The other, perched high above, represented the luxury, indulgence, and denial of the ruling elite. Yet, as we move forward in our journey, we must step away from the stillness of the catacombs and into the palace, the heart of the monarchy's world, to understand the decay of the old order. It was here, in the gilded halls of Versailles, that the ultimate clash between the old world of the monarchy and the new world of revolutionary ideals would reach its dramatic climax. As the revolution continued to build momentum, the tension between these two worlds, the decadent monarchy and the rising forces of equality and justice, would grow, culminating in a violent reckoning that would see the end of the old regime and the beginning of a new era. The luxury of Versailles may have seemed distant from the bloodshed in the streets of Paris and the suffering of the peasants, but it was, in many ways, the very symbol of everything the revolution sought to destroy: privilege, oppression, and the unjust concentration of power. The final moments of Versailles, before it too was consumed by the flames of revolution, would mark the end of an era and the fall of a world that had, for centuries, been built on inequality and excess. As we approach the final chapter in our journey through revolutionary France, we must consider the battle between the old world of the monarchy and the new world of revolutionary fervor. This battle was not just a political struggle, but a cultural and social clash between two completely different visions of what France should be: a country of privilege and power for the few, or a nation of equality and justice for all. For years, the monarchy had lived in a world of excess. The Palace of Versailles, with its ornate chandeliers, gilded furniture, and elaborate gardens, stood as the ultimate symbol of the old regime's excesses. Inside the palace, the king and his court danced and feasted, while the masses suffered outside. The opulence of Versailles was in direct contrast to the hunger, poverty, and hardship of the French people, particularly the peasants who lived in constant fear of famine and taxation. Yet, despite the growing unrest outside the palace walls, the royal family and the aristocracy remained blind to the mounting discontent of the people. Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, seemingly out of touch with the dire situation in Paris and the provinces, continued to live their lives in a state of luxurious indifference, while the revolutionary spirit spread like wildfire. The decay of Versailles was not just a decay of physical luxury, but also of the old social order. Monarchy, aristocracy, and privilege had been the guiding principles of French society for centuries. And yet, By the time the revolution gained momentum, the people of France had had enough. The final moments of Versailles symbolized the last gasps of an old world, one that had been built on oppression and inequality, and the revolutionary ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity stood in stark opposition to this decaying system. The revolutionary fervor that had begun in the streets of Paris began to spread to Versailles, as the storming of the Bastille in 1789 had marked the first major victory for the people. So too did the events that transpired at Versailles mark the climax of the struggle between the old and new worlds. Louis XVI and his court would find themselves trapped in the very palace that had once been their sanctuary from the harsh realities of France. In the summer of 1789, the Women's March on Versailles, spurred by the hunger and rising discontent, would force the royal family to move from Versailles to Paris, effectively ending the monarchy's reign over the palace. The symbolism of the royal family's forced departure from the palace they had once ruled with such indulgence cannot be overstated. Versailles, once a beacon of the old order, was now empty, a prison for the monarchy, no longer a place of luxury, but a place of exile. The battle between old and new was not just fought in the streets, but within the very walls of Versailles itself. The opulence of the palace stood in stark contrast to the suffering and desperation that surrounded it. As the royal family was brought to the streets of Paris and ultimately faced trial and execution, Versailles became the final monument to a regime that had lost touch with the needs of its people. The decay of Versailles marked the end of an era, the fall of a world that had once been defined by excess, oppression, and class divide. The revolution's promises of equality and justice were now in full motion, and the monarchy, once so deeply entrenched in power, had been overthrown. Versailles, the last bastion of the old world, had been swallowed by the fires of revolution, its splendor reduced to ashes. As we transition from the decadence of Versailles to the revolution's final reckoning, we are reminded of the power of change, how the seeds of revolution can grow from the discontent of the people and eventually bring about the fall of the old order. The catacombs, with their silent witness to the victims of terror, serve as the underworld of a revolution that consumed its own. Versailles, on the other hand, represents the world above, where the royals and aristocrats still clung to their privileges, even as the world around them crumbled. The revolution was a battle not just for political change, but for the soul of France, for the ideas that would shape the future of the nation. The luxury of Versailles, with its excess and detachment, stood in direct opposition to the struggle of the people and the revolutionary ideals that would eventually reshape the country. As we move forward, we will explore the final moments of Versailles, where the decadence of the monarchy gave way to the terrible consequences of the revolution. The palace, once the symbol of the old order, would become a ruin, swept away by the tides of revolutionary change. Imagine standing before the towering gates of Versailles, the grandest palace ever built to reflect the magnificence of the French monarchy. The gates themselves, glistening in the sunlight, stand like an impenetrable barrier between the outside world and the luxury within. The metalwork is intricately wrought in golden patterns, shimmering in the light, an exquisite first impression of what lies beyond. Towering walls, adorned with statues and carvings of mythic figures, rise into the sky, imposing and grand, an indomitable symbol of royal authority and divine right. These gates, gleaming in the midday sun, seem to say that nothing of the common world is allowed to touch this sanctuary. Behind the gates, the sprawling gardens unfold in an endless cascade of greenery, manicured with an artist's precision. The hedges, trimmed with mathematical care, form neat geometric patterns, leading to fountains that sparkle like diamonds in the sun, their water cascading in rhythmic harmony. The air is thick with the scent of freshly bloomed roses, lavender, and the occasional, almost sickly sweet perfume of jasmina, reminder that here everything is designed to please the senses. The gardens seem to stretch endlessly in every direction, their vibrant flowers and glistening water creating an atmosphere that feels detached from the everyday world, a space that exists only for beauty and elegance. As you walk deeper into the palace grounds, you find yourself in awe of the grandiosity that seems to define Versailles at every turn. The paths are lined with statues and marble columns, and every few steps you catch the sound of a distant fountain splashing water into a stone basin, its gentle sound mixing with the whisper of the wind in the trees. The contrast between the luxury of Versailles and the hardships outside its gates is jarring, almost surreal. As you move further toward the palace, the air shifts, becoming cooler, infused with the scent of incense, a deep, resinous aroma that brings a sense of sacredness, even in this world of earthly delights. When you step into the palace itself, The opulence hits you with all its overwhelming luxury. The moment you pass through the doors, you are greeted by the sight of mirrored walls, the kind that reflect the light so perfectly that the palace seems to stretch far beyond its physical bounds, creating the illusion of an infinite space. The mirrors on the walls, reflecting the golden chandeliers overhead, seem to multiply the light, filling the room with a radiant glow. The chandeliers themselves are draped in sparkling crystals, catching the light and casting it in all directions, creating an effect that feels both majestic and impossibly delicate. The gilded details in every corner of the room gleam softly, reflecting the luxury that seems to suffuse every inch of Versailles. The marble floors, polished to a mirror-like sheen, stretch beneath your feet, their pale whiteness interrupted only by intricate patterns of colored stone, laid out with painstaking care to create a sense of order and harmony. As courtiers glide across the space, their heels click sharply on the polished stone, breaking the otherwise serene quiet. The sound of footsteps, the slight rustling of silks brushing together, and the soft murmur of conversation creates an atmosphere of constant movement, but in a way that feels composed like the endless ticking of a royal clock, precise and controlled. The voices of the courtiers speaking softly, often in quiet tones, whisper secrets, rumors, and alliances, creating a low hum that fills the room with an undercurrent of intrigue. The tapestries that adorn the walls depict scenes from mythology, history, and the royal family's glory. Every one of them seems to tell a story of opulence, power, and divine favor, reinforcing the monarchy's belief that their rule was ordained by the heavens. Gold thread weaves its way through each tapestry, and even the silk curtains that frame the windows are carefully chosen to reflect the taste and wealth of the monarch. In a room so rich in detail, the air itself feels thick with history, and you can't help but sense the deep weight of centuries-old traditions that have lived within these walls. There is a distinct perfume in the air as you wander through Versailles, one that is light and refreshing, yet heavy with the luxury of the place. The scent of roses, lavender, and other exotic flowers perfumes the air, a deliberate touch to enhance the experience of indulgence. However, underneath these sweet floral notes, there is also a faint trace of candles, their delicate fragrance mingling with the smell of incense, a sweet, resinous smoke that often lingers in the halls of Versailles. The incense is used in an attempt to mask any mustiness in the air, though it can never fully cover up the undeniable staleness that lurks in corners, forgotten over time. The mixture of smells creates a bittersweet contrast, as if the very beauty of Versailles is trying to mask the creeping awareness that the palace itself is not as pristine as it appears. The faint scent of lavender evokes a sense of calm, but there is something almost suffocating about the overwhelming luxury. Each step through the palace leads you further into a world of self-contained indulgence, where reality and grandeur become indistinguishable. You are surrounded by beauty, yet it is not beauty that can be touched. It is beauty that is carefully controlled, curated, and designed to impress, not to be experienced on a more human level. It becomes clear that Versailles, with all its fragrances and jewels, is a refuge from the real world, where the reality of hunger, suffering, and revolution is not allowed to seep in. As you immerse yourself in the world of Versailles, the beauty is undeniable, but it begins to feel otherworldly, as though this palace exists in a reality of its own, disconnected from the struggles of the people. Every detail is designed to make the visitors feel that they are in the presence of something divine. The lavish ballrooms are where history is made, where royalty becomes eternal, and where the powerful elite gather in an environment that is carefully sculpted for their enjoyment. And yet, this beauty begins to take on a more tragic hue when you think of the world outside Versailles. For all its grandeur, for all its lavishness, the palace is an echo of a disconnected royal fantasy. Famine, discontent, and unrest brew in the streets of Paris, and even as the courtiers twirl in silks, the seeds of revolution are being sown just beyond the palace gates. The disparity between the world within Versailles and the real world outside only deepens, and what was once seen as the height of elegance becomes increasingly irrelevant. The opulence that had once been the right of the monarchy now feels like a ticking clock, and each second brings Versailles closer to the collapse that history would eventually bring. Here, in the heart of Versailles, the contrast between the luxury and the growing unrest outside is ever present, and as the years pass, the palace becomes more of a symbol of resistance to change than a seat of power. The splendor of Versailles may have been seen by its inhabitants as unassailable, but in the end, it was this very decadence that would contribute to its fall. The palace, in all its glorious success, would ultimately become a prison for those who once ruled there, reminding us of the fragility of opulence. when the people rise against the systems that perpetuate such inequality. At the break of dawn, while the rest of France slept or toiled under the weight of their daily struggles, Versailles stirred with a flurry of activity. The sun's first rays were just beginning to stretch across the gardens, glinting off the ornate marble statues, when the morning rituals of Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI began to unfold in a perfectly orchestrated sequence. These rituals were not just about the mundane preparation for the day. They were a performance, a theatrical act to reaffirm the royal image and perpetuate the illusion of divine rule. Marie Antoinette, often considered the heart of Versailles' courtly spectacle, would begin her day with a ritual of beauty and grandeur that became the subject of public admiration. The Queen's morning started in her private apartments, attended by a retinue of ladies-in-waiting maids and various attendants. The ritual was as much about visual perfection as it was about political symbolism. As the first light of the day filtered through the towering windows of her lavish room, she would sit before a grand mirror, its ornate gold frame reflecting the gilded walls around her. The Queen's preparation was not an intimate act, it was one of public spectacle. Makeup, hair, and clothing became an elaborate performance for those who watched her every move. The application of makeup was no simple matter. White face powder was meticulously applied, rouge delicately dabbed on her cheeks, and the rosy tint of her lips gave her the illusion of perpetual youth and vitality. Marie Antoinette's beauty rituals, while luxurious, were also a statement of royal authority. Every step was intended to underscore her status as the Queen, a sovereign adorned in the finest silks and lace. But it wasn't only her appearance that mattered. The act of getting dressed was also a public ritual. The Queen's wardrobe was made up of the most expensive fabrics, brocades, velvets, and satin. Every gown was carefully crafted to reflect her royal status and the political power she represented. The process of getting dressed, an act of personal intimacy, was a performance before a large audience of court officials and ladies. The open doors of the Queen's private chambers allowed the courtiers to gaze upon the Queen's magnificence as she prepared for the day. Even the most private aspects of her life were public in a palace where every movement and gesture carried political weight. For Louis XVI, the morning ritual was somewhat less theatrical, though equally steeped in formality. As the King of France, his day began with more official duties, yet it too carried the weight of public expectation. The monarch's routine was designed to underscore the image of the king as a divine figure, one chosen by God to rule. His morning was usually marked by a private council with ministers, as well as ceremonial duties that demanded his attention. Unlike the Queen, Louis XVI's rituals were less about personal presentation and more about the administration of the kingdom, though even these were steeped in ritual. His duties included reviewing letters, meeting with his closest advisors, and overseeing matters of state. Louis' private councils often focused on the management of the monarchy's finances, a subject that was becoming increasingly problematic. The financial strain on the monarchy, exacerbated by wars and extravagant spending, was a burden that grew heavier with each passing day. Despite the weight of the crown, Louis's involvement in the daily running of his kingdom was minimal. His decision-making often came second to the influence of his advisors and the powerful courtiers who surrounded him. His disconnection from the common people's suffering was becoming more pronounced with each passing year. At Versailles, the King's and Queen's daily lives were not just defined by the duties of royalty, but by a carefully controlled choreography that maintained the balance of power. The court at Versailles was a stage where every movement, every word, and every glance carried significant political weight. The courtier's life was a delicate dance, and those at Versailles spent their days engaging in a constant battle for favor, with every interaction carefully managed to maintain alliances or undermine rivals. The nobility of Versailles was a complex and sometimes treacherous network of connections. Every courtier had a role to play, from the most powerful noble to the humblest servant, and their worth was often measured by how close they were to the throne. Etiquette was paramount. Every gesture, every bow, every word spoken was scrutinized. The ruling class of Versailles understood the weight of this performance. Those who failed to adhere to the strict norms of behavior risked losing their position in the royal favor. The famous court intrigues and scheming that defined the politics of Versailles were more than just gossip. They were the mechanisms of a highly stratified society. Rivalries between courtiers could have grave consequences for one's standing at court, as well as for one's wealth, influence, and even safety. One could lose favor by making a misstep in conversation, showing signs of disrespect to the king or queen, or failing to align oneself with the right political factions. It wasn't enough to be a good and honorable person. One had to be an expert at social gamesmanship to survive at Versailles. While the aristocracy battled for status, the common folk lived a life entirely removed from the luxuries of Versailles. They worked tirelessly in the fields, bearing the heavy burden of taxes imposed by the monarchy. At Versailles, however, the game of appearances was the most critical pursuit, and this obsession with luxury permeated every facet of daily life. As evening fell, the grandeur of Versailles truly came to life. The royal court would gather for banquets, masquerades, and opera performances, all designed to celebrate the monarchy's power and keep the elites entertained, though not necessarily fulfilled. The banquets were lavish affairs, with multiple courses of rich, extravagant food, wines and desserts, served under the flickering light of massive chandeliers. Yet, despite the abundance, there was something distinctly hollow about these gatherings. These were not celebrations of true connection or joy, but more performances meant to bolster the image of the monarchy. Marie Antoinette's grand masquerades were among the most famous of these gatherings. Courtiers and nobles would dress in elaborate costumes, their faces hidden behind masks, allowing them to indulge in a brief escape from the constraints of their status. The music, the dancing, and the spectacle of it all created a sense of transcendent joy, but it was fleeting, as if the very extravagance of the event was designed to cover the cracks in the monarchy's fragile social contract. The opera performances and theatrical spectacles were similarly designed to glorify the monarchy, with art and performance used as tools to celebrate the royal family. The aristocracy would gather to witness elaborate ballets and symphonies, their attention focused on the performance, not the broader societal issues that were increasingly affecting the people outside the palace walls. And yet, for all the beauty and extravagance, these events ultimately fostered little genuine connection. The elegant feasts, though indulgent, were empty in a way. The rich food and drink were consumed in large quantities, but the hunger for something more, whether it be genuine social connection or an awareness of the suffering outside, remained unaddressed. The banquets became just another performance, just another display of wealth, and yet, in time, they symbolized the decay of a monarchy out of touch with the needs of its people. The etiquette at Versailles, with its carefully constructed rituals and unspoken rules, was a microcosm of the society at large. While luxury and affluence were lauded and preserved, the reality outside Versailles could not be ignored forever. The opulence of the palace was in sharp contrast to the grinding poverty and tension that increasingly defined the lives of those outside. Versailles had become not just a symbol of monarchy, but a final refuge for a system that was decaying from within, even as the world outside was screaming for change. As we leave these extravagant gatherings, the illusion of luxury and perfect harmony begins to falter. The decay that had long been evident inside the walls of Versailles would soon spill out, affecting the very foundations of France itself. What began as a grand spectacle of royalty and grace would, in the end, be remembered as the beginning of the monarchy's fall, as revolution knocked at the gates of Versailles, bringing everything to an abrupt and tragic end. Versailles, in its majestic splendor, stood as a world apart from the realities of life in France. While inside the grand halls, the nobility indulged in luxury, extravagance, and opulence. Just beyond the gates, the common people, particularly the peasants, struggled with unimaginable hardships. The contrast between these two worlds could not have been more pronounced. Inside Versailles, the royals lived in their golden cage, untouched by the hunger, poverty, and suffering that had begun to gnaw at the very heart of France. Each day at Versailles began with rituals of grandeur, lavish meals, rich fabrics, and endless feasts. The scent of perfumed roses and the rustling of silks were the backdrop to the lives of the royalty, while just outside the palace walls, the peasants woke in tiny, cold, damp huts, filled with the smell of stale bread and rotting grain, knowing their daily survival was an ongoing struggle. The court at Versailles was living in a completely separate reality, one where luxury and indulgence were not only expected, but assumed. The royals and aristocrats were blind to the suffering just outside their gates. For the aristocrats and royals, luxury had become not just a privilege, but a right, something taken for granted. The idea of hunger was inconceivable to them, just as the daily toil of the peasants seemed foreign and irrelevant. The royals did not hear the mournful cries of the hungry in the streets of Paris. They did not feel the cold grip of poverty that kept families in their cramped homes, scraping together the last bits of bread just to survive another day. The peasants lived in a reality far removed from the lavish feasts at Versailles. The wealth and extravagance enjoyed by the aristocracy existed on the back of the peasants' labor, and yet, the aristocracy was blind to their plight. In fact, the royalty and nobles rarely ventured beyond the gates of Versailles. Their days were filled with ceremonial duties, court politics, and the indulgences of their luxurious lifestyle, while outside, the peasants toiled endlessly in the fields. The disconnection between the aristocrats and the commoners was not just physical, but emotional. The royals did not empathize with the suffering outside their palace walls. They remained isolated, surrounded by their courtiers, in a world of comfort and security, where the truth of the peasants' lives was unknown to them. At the core of the disconnection between the aristocracy and the people was the stark inequality that defined the French social system. The nobility and royalty thrived in their lavish palaces at the expense of the peasants who were forced to labor tirelessly for a pittance. The wealth that flowed so freely into the hands of the aristocracy came at the cost of the peasants who worked in the fields, in the mines and in the factories to produce the goods that kept the palace running. The nobles lived off the labor of the peasants, taxing them for land and resources they didn't own but were forced to work for. The taille, the land tax, was just one example of the grinding tax burden that weighed down the common folk. The peasants were expected to pay taxes for land they did not own, while the aristocracy, living on those same lands, paid little or nothing in return. This unbalanced system created a massive wealth gap between the aristocrats and the peasants. The nobles maintained their opulence with luxuries like fine wine, silk robes, and banquets, all funded by the sweat and blood of the peasants who grew their food, harvested their timber, and worked tirelessly on their estates. Even land was not owned in a fair manner. The nobles controlled vast estates, farming them with the labor of peasants who had no choice but to work the land for them. In turn, the peasants were required to pay feudal dues, giving a portion of their harvest to their lords in exchange for the right to work the land. The land on which they worked was not theirs, but the aristocrats never had to lift a finger in its cultivation. The nobles reaped the profits of the peasants' labor while providing nothing in return. The royalty, surrounded by a court of courtiers and flatterers, spent their days in their palatial surroundings, blissfully unaware of the struggles that kept their lives in motion. This immense imbalance of wealth led to a growing resentment from the peasants, who saw the lavish lifestyle of the royals as a mockery of their suffering. The idea that the king and queen could continue to indulge in their luxuries, while the commoners were starving and burdened by taxes, became intolerable to many. The nobility's wealth was built on the hard labor of the peasants, and yet the aristocrats were detached from the reality of the peasant's life, which seemed to carry an endless cycle of struggle and hardship. The greatest tragedy of Versailles was not just the disconnection between the aristocrats and the peasants, but the numbness that defined the royalty's relationship with the poor. While poverty and starvation ravaged the common folk, those at Versailles were blind to the suffering that surrounded them. The excessive wealth of the aristocracy, lived in luxury and indulgence, created an empathy gap that no one was willing to bridge. The royals and nobles seemed so far removed from the real world of their people, that it was almost impossible for them to even imagine what their lives were like. At Versailles, the gilded life of the monarchy was lived without any moral or emotional accountability to the peasantry. The banquets, masquerades, and opera performances continued as usual, while the peasants were struggling to make ends meet. The court's extravagance and excess became symbols of how out of touch the royalty had become with the real world. The king and queen, though aware of the rising discontent in the streets, were isolated in their world of luxury where chandeliers hung from the ceiling mirrors, reflected their divine authority, and their jewels sparkled more brightly than the stars in the sky. The disconnect between the two classes, aristocrats and peasants, was stark and irreparable. The nobles felt little empathy for the plight of the poor, and the rich lifestyle at Versailles served as a constant reminder of the unfairness of the system. It became increasingly difficult for the peasants to see the luxury of Versailles as anything but a representation of their exploitation, a blatant display of oppression. This growing resentment fueled the revolution, as more and more common people began to feel that the inequities of Versailles were unsustainable. In time, Versailles and the court's disconnection from the suffering of the people became one of the greatest grievances of the revolution. The luxury of Versailles, the lavish palaces, and the exorbitant feasts, was no longer something to be admired. It was a reminder of oppression. The people saw that their royal family was unaware and unconcerned with their plight, and this became the spark that would light the fire of revolution. As the revolution grew in strength, the world of Versailles continued to exist in its bubble of extravagance, untouched by the reality of the people. The royals and nobles lived in their world of luxury, completely disconnected from the struggles of the common folk. and this disconnect ultimately sealed the fate of the monarchy. When the revolutionaries finally stormed the gates of Versailles, they tore down not just the palace walls, but the entire system that upheld the monarchy's privilege. The court's inability to understand or empathize with the suffering of the peasants became its downfall, and in the end, Versailles, with its splendor, could no longer hide the realities of revolution. While the storm of revolution brewed just beyond the gates of Versailles, the royalty remained firmly ensconced in their isolated world of grandeur, unaware of the growing fury sweeping across the country. The lives of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette were meticulously controlled by ritual and protocol, their daily routines framed by ceremonies, etiquette, and the luxury that surrounded them. In this world, every gesture was deliberate, every step in the palace calculated to reinforce their divine right to rule. But despite the rituals that marked their existence, both monarchs remained blinded to the increasingly urgent cries for change coming from every corner of France. At Versailles, the aristocracy and court officials lived in a bubble, enveloped by their own world of privilege. Here, the struggles of the common people seemed distant, too far removed from the perfectly manicured gardens, the golden chandeliers, and the gilded mirrors that reflected an image of imperial splendor. Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, though well aware of the unrest in the cities, were largely insulated from its realities. In fact, the royal family's world was so deeply rooted in luxury that they could hardly fathom the scale of the economic crises, food shortages, and discontent simmering outside the walls of Versailles. The peasants and the working class had long been struggling under the weight of increased taxes, inflation, and famine, but these issues were either too far removed from the royal court or simply ignored. As the monarchy continued to indulge in extravagant celebrations and balls, the rest of France was grappling with desperation. There was an increasing disconnect between the pleasure-seeking court at Versailles and the struggling populace. Revolutionary ideas began to slowly trickle into the court, but they were mostly dismissed as disruptive and foreign, not something that belonged in the highly structured world of Versailles. The aristocrats considered these ideals, liberty, equality, and fraternity, to be dangerous and unworthy of attention, because they clashed with the old order of absolute monarchy. In a place like Versailles, where luxury and etiquette dictated the rhythm of daily life, the court's obsession with its own beauty left little room for the urgent and growing problems of the kingdom. The financial strain on the country, the rising cost of bread, and the severe taxes that burdened the peasants were nothing more than distant whispers to the aristocracy. The lavish feasts and endless entertainments served as distractions, keeping the royals focused on their splendid surroundings rather than on the desperate cries of the people outside. The opulence of Versailles, with its immaculate gardens and golden halls, was beginning to take on a mocking quality. While the nobility basked in the comfort of silk gowns, fine wines, and elaborate ceremonies, the rest of France was being consumed by a worsening crisis. The court's luxury, once a symbol of royal glory, began to feel like an insult to the peasants, who could barely afford a loaf of bread. This growing resentment was felt even in the palace, though the royals remained out of touch with the depth of the discontent brewing outside. Versailles, with its beauty, became a symbol of excess, while the rest of the country was faced with a stark reality of famine and suffering. Among the many symbols of disconnection between the royals and the people, Marie Antoinette became the most prominent. She was often blamed for the extravagance that defined the royal court, and her personal lifestyle became a symbol of the wasteful monarchy that was out of touch with the struggles of ordinary French people. Marie Antoinette, known for her lavish gowns, her famous high hairdos, and her expensive tastes, became the epitome of the royalty's excess. She was frequently criticized for her apparent indifference to the hardships faced by the common folk. Her fashion, in particular, became a focal point for public anger. She was frequently seen wearing elaborate dresses made of the finest silks, accessorized with expensive jewels and lace. As the rest of France grappled with economic collapse, the Queen's love for luxury seemed completely insensitive to the realities outside Versailles. One of the most famous, though likely apocryphal, quotes attributed to her was, "Let them eat cake," which supposedly reflects her ignorance of the people's hunger and her detachment from their suffering. While there is no evidence that she ever uttered these words, the phrase became a symbol of her disconnection from the common people's plight, and over time it cemented her reputation as out of touch with the desperation of the French populace. Her extravagant lifestyle only exacerbated her image as a queen who was completely ignorant of the people's pain. Marie Antoinette's spending on fashion, her fondness for jewels, and her indulgence in luxury made her politically toxic in the eyes of the people. In times of crisis, When peasants were starving, it seemed unconscionable for the queen to spend vast sums on luxurious gowns and lavish banquets. Her court became the symbol of royal mismanagement, and as tensions escalated, her image as the extravagant queen who lived in denial would play a crucial role in her eventual downfall. Marie Antoinette's inability or unwillingness to adapt to the changing times only deepened her alienation from the public. The queen's life had largely been about appearances, the grandeur of her fashion, the elegance of her hair, and the luxury of her meals. There was no room for reform or even an understanding of the suffering that had begun to envelop France. For Marie Antoinette, the Palace of Versailles was a refuge where she could indulge in the fantasy of royal life, but it was also a place that isolated her from the realities outside. While the revolution was brewing, and the peasants cried out for relief, she remained wrapped in her lavish gowns, far removed from the agony of the people. Her indifference to the common people became an increasingly dangerous political liability as the revolution gathered steam. Her extravagant lifestyle and disconnect from the crises of the country played a significant role in her eventual downfall, as the French people's anger grew into a fury that could no longer be contained. As the years passed, Marie Antoinette's failure to adapt her behavior to the mounting tensions only amplified the resentment against her. The growing cries of the people, calling for food, justice, and reform, were met with indifference by the queen and her court. Her love for luxury and her apparent ignorance of the revolutionary ideals that were beginning to circulate within France made her seem like a relic of a bygone era. While the revolutionaries called for the abolition of the monarchy and the establishment of a new republic, Marie Antoinette continued to live in her world of indulgence and splendor, unable to change with the times. Her failure to engage with the realities of the revolution ultimately made her the ideal scapegoat for the revolutionaries. Her image, once that of a charming queen, was now that of the rich, out-of-arch monarch who symbolized the arrogance of the French elite. The revolutionary mob in Paris began to see her as a symbol of all that was wrong with the monarchy, a queen who had done nothing but indulge in her own pleasures. While the rest of France sank deeper into poverty and despair, Marie Antoinette's failure to connect with the suffering of her people, her insatiable desire for luxury became the very thing that would lead to her tragic fall. As the revolution reached its climax, the Queen's detachment from reality became a damning reminder of how out of touch the monarchy had become, and how disastrous that disconnection would ultimately prove to be. Marie Antoinette, once a beloved queen, had become the symbol of a monarchy that had lost its way. Her indifference to the suffering of the people, her extravagant lifestyle, and her failure to understand the growing revolutionary fervor ultimately sealed her fate. As the guillotine loomed ever closer, it was clear that the royalty's disconnect from the people embodied in Marie Antoinette's own actions had irreparably harmed the monarchy's image, leading to its ultimate destruction. Versailles, once the epitome of luxury, had become a symbol of everything wrong with the old order, and Marie Antoinette's unwillingness to change in the face of mounting unrest was perhaps the most glaring example of the failure of the French monarchy to adapt to the demands of a changing world. As the revolution began to take root in France, the majestic Palace of Versailles, once a symbol of unshakable royal power, started to lose its luster. The glittering chandeliers, the golden mirrors, and the vast gardens that had once represented the divine right of the monarchy to rule were now being overshadowed by a growing wave of discontent that spread from the streets of Paris to the very gates of the royal residence. Versailles, which had been a place of immense luxury where the monarchy showcased its power and privilege, was now seen by many as an anachronistic symbol of excess, completely out of touch with the realities of the world outside its gilded walls. The bourgeoisie, the middle class that had long been overshadowed by the nobility, began to find its voice, and with it, a growing resistance to the entrenched aristocratic privilege that had for so long gone unchallenged. They began to demand more of a role in France's future, challenging the aristocratic excess that had become so entrenched in places like Versailles. The discontent that had been growing among the common folk found new expression within the bourgeois class as many began to see the monarchy as a draining influence on the nation's wealth, contributing to the economic hardships that affected all but the richest nobility. The once unified court began to fracture, infighting between courtiers, each eager to maintain or increase their own power and favor with the king and queen, grew more pronounced. The moral decay of Versailles, which had long been masked by its external beauty and royal pageantry, now seemed to be seeping into the very fabric of court life. The tensions between the old order and the people were no longer just an abstract concept but something that began to manifest in the daily rituals at the palace. The privileged court, once united under the crown, was now deeply divided, with each faction struggling to preserve its own position as the kingdom fell into chaos. This infighting, coupled with the growing disillusionment among those in the court, began to signal the decline of Versailles. As the world outside the palace gates became more hostile to the ancien, the once glamorous palace began to lose its power and relevance. It was no longer the vibrant center of the monarchy's glory. It had become a place of retreat, where the royal family sought refuge from the troubles of the outside world, but could do little to reverse the unfolding crisis. As Louis XVI's authority continued to wane, so too did the power of Versailles. The king, once seen as the ultimate authority, became more of a figurehead than a true ruler. He had become incapable of grasping the magnitude of the crisis and revolution that was gaining momentum across the country. His inability to connect with the revolutionary forces or understand their motives further entrenched his irrelevance at Versailles. As the revolution crept closer to the gates, Louis XVI seemed increasingly out of touch, a monarch unable to step outside the royal comfort of Versailles to confront the reality that was knocking at the door. It was during the months leading up to the French Revolution's tipping point that Versailles would face its final challenge, the Women's March on Versailles, an event that marked the collapse of the palace's once imposing facade. The Women's March, which began on October 5, 1789, was sparked by hunger, the deep, gnawing hunger that had become all too familiar to the poor of Paris. The rising cost of bread, the staple food for the common folk, had led to a widespread shortage, exacerbated by inflation and poor harvests. For many, bread was the only affordable means of survival, and the scarcity of bread fueled widespread anger. The women of Paris, the primary breadwinners for their families, began to organize in response to this crisis. The streets of Paris filled with rumors of royal mismanagement, of lavish court feasts in the midst of starvation. They began to demand action, a change that would allow them to feed their families and restore some measure of dignity. Their demands were not just for bread, but for justice, the recognition of their suffering, and a change in the way France was governed. Driven by a combination of desperation and fury, thousands of Parisian women, armed with pitchforks and brooms, made the march to Versailles, determined to confront the monarchy. They made their way through the rain-soaked streets, chanting and protesting, until they reached the gates of the royal palace. Upon arrival, they demanded to see Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI, seeking an end to the royal excesses that they felt had robbed them of their livelihoods. The hunger they had endured for months fueled their anger, but it was also their unshakable belief that the royalty, living in their palatial excess, were blind to the suffering of the people that led them to Versailles. As the women breached the gates of Versailles, the palace's grandeur, its gilded walls and opulent halls, suddenly felt hollow. The revolutionary tide had arrived at the very heart of the monarchy, and the aristocracy's golden refuge was no longer invulnerable. The women stormed the palace, and the royal family was forced to leave the safety of their palace, heading for Paris, where they would be placed under the watchful eye of the revolutionaries. The Women's March was not only about hunger, it was the physical manifestation of people's anger, a shift in power that would lead to the end of Versailles glory. As the royal family was led from the security of Versailles to the Tuileries Palace in Paris, the monarchy's former seat of power became a symbol of its downfall. Versailles, which had once stood as a beacon of luxury and absolute power, was now a prison for the royal family. The royals were no longer the rulers of France, but prisoners of the revolution, a living reminder of the system that had brought the country to the brink of collapse. The Women's March marked the beginning of the end for Versailles. The grand halls and majestic gardens of the palace were no longer a place of royal indulgence, but a symbol of arrogance and oppression. The events of that day shattered the illusion of invincibility that Versailles had long represented. No longer could the monarchy live in its gilded bubble, surrounded by courtiers who worshipped them, while the rest of the country starved. The forceful removal of the royal family from Versailles was the final blow to the symbol of old aristocratic power. The monarchy's decline was accelerated in that moment, as the people of France, spurred by their hunger and frustration, tore down the last remnants of the ancienne's unchecked privilege. The palace that had once symbolized absolute monarchy was now seen as the heart of a decaying system, its splendor no longer a symbol of royal grandeur, but of the decay of an old world that could no longer survive in the face of revolutionary change. The Women's March was not just a march for bread, it was the beginning of the end for a monarchical system that had grown so detached from the suffering of its people. Versailles was no longer a safe haven for the royals, it was a prison that symbolized the fall of the old order and the rise of a new, uncertain future for France. The royalty's escape from Versailles and their forced relocation to Paris was the death knell for the palace's glory. The once grand halls that had witnessed royal indulgence, political intrigue, and ceremonial power now stood as a silent testimony to the collapse of an entire social order. Versailles, once a symbol of invincible grandeur, was now merely a ruin of a system that could no longer sustain itself. The revolution had reached its doors, and Versailles could no longer hide behind its walls of luxury. The monarchy was no longer in control, the people had spoken, and Versailles' glimmering walls had crumbled under the weight of their voices. The decline of Versailles is not just a matter of its physical decay, but of the collapse of a symbol, the collapse of a monarchy and the entire ancien. What once stood as the pinnacle of absolute power and luxury now stands as a ghost of the past, its splendor reduced to ruins. The revolution, in its fury and its idealism, left nothing untouched, and even Versailles, the very heart of the royal court, was consumed by the forces of change. The gilded walls that had once reflected the glory of the monarchy were now shattered, and what was once a symbol of royal dominance became a silent testament to the irrelevance of the old world. As the royal family was forced to leave the safety and luxury of Versailles, the palace's very purpose was extinguished. It was no longer a seat of power, but a symbol of everything that was wrong with the old regime, a regime that had been out of touch, out of step, and increasingly alienated from the realities of the people. The French monarchy had failed to adapt to the demands of its people, and Versailles had become the embodiment of that failure. What had once been a refuge for the monarchs, a place of ceremonial power, and a testament to royal glory, was now a prison. The king and queen were no longer sovereigns, but prisoners of the revolution. Stripped of the luxury and power that had once defined their reign, Versailles had, in effect, become irrelevant. The forces of the revolution had shown that the age of absolute monarchy was over, and the world would never look at Versailles the same way again. The fall of Versailles was not just a physical event, but a political and social one. It marked the final collapse of a system that had lasted for centuries, the feudal system, the monarchy's absolute rule, and the growing gulf between the aristocracy and the common people. The fall of Versailles symbolized the end of an era, the end of unquestioned royal power, and the beginning of a new political order in France. Versailles, with all its beauty and grandeur, became a relic of a bygone age, swallowed up by the chaos and hope of the French Revolution. The Revolution, in its quest to overturn the old world and create something new, left Versailles as a silent witness to the rupture between past and present. As the royal family was driven from their once great palace and the monarchy crumbled, Versailles remained behind, its glistening mirrors and golden chandeliers fading into history. The once grand halls became more than just empty spaces, they became metaphors for the disconnection between power and the people. The luxury and excess that had defined Versailles now served as a reminder of the divine detachment of the monarchy, a symbol of the disconnect between the royals and the people they were meant to serve. In its final days, Versailles was stripped of its glamour, and in its place stood the reality of a new France, one that was no longer ruled by the aristocracy but by revolutionary ideals that promised liberty, equality, and fraternity. The palace, once the crown jewel of monarchy, stood as a ruin, both physically and ideologically, marking the end of the ancien and the dawn of a new era. Though the revolution swept through Versailles, leaving its walls empty and its halls quiet, the legacy of the palace remains. Even as the French Revolution marched on with its promises of freedom and equality, Versailles continued to haunt the national memory. The palace was a silent reminder of the extravagance and inequality of the monarchy, and as the revolutionaries tore down the old order, Versailles stood as a monument to opulence gone awry. In the echoes of its once glittering walls, Versailles continued to symbolize the corruption of unchecked power and the disconnected luxury of the royal family. The legacy of Versailles, however, is not just one of decay and collapse. It also serves as a symbol of excess, a legacy that continues to define the relationship between the ruling class and the common people. Even after the revolution's victorious claim over the monarchy, Versailles remained an unspoken truth about the dangers of absolute power. It is a reminder that royal privilege, no matter how glittering or grand, cannot exist in isolation from the needs and suffering of the people. Versailles was a place of beauty, but also a place of excess, where power and wealth were concentrated in the hands of a few, leaving the majority to suffer in silence. Even though Versailles was no longer the seat of power after the revolution, it remained a symbol in the collective consciousness of France. It was no longer a place of royal power, but it had become a lesson in the dangers of excess, disconnection, and oppression. Its beauty, its grandeur, and its glory were forever linked with the revolution's failure to provide freedom for all. The disparity between Versailles and the reality of the common people was stark and unignorable. and it remained ingrained in the memory of the French Revolution. Even as the palace's splendor faded, its legacy lived on as a reminder of how power could blind the elite to the needs of the people. As we turn away from the legacy of Versailles and move deeper into the consequences of the Revolution, we are confronted with the truth of the French people's sacrifices, the price they paid for the ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity. Versailles, as a symbol of everything wrong with the monarchy, was forever linked to the rise of revolutionary change, but it was also a symbol of what came after. The revolution's promises, while bold and idealistic, carried with them cost sacrifices that would shape the future of France and reverberate through the ages. The fall of Versailles and the collapse of the monarchy led to a reckoning not just with the past, but with the future of France, and the sacrifices that would be required to build something new. As we move forward into the next phase of the revolution's legacy, we will examine the wider impact of these changes, how they spread throughout Europe, and the sacrifices made for the revolution's ideals. From the streets of Paris to the far reaches of the French Empire, the revolution carried ripples that would affect not just France, but the entire world. The fall of Versailles was just one chapter in this larger tale of political upheaval and social transformation, a chapter that set the stage for the final reckoning of an old world, and the birth of a new one.